The wind was the only thing that ever truly moved with freedom in Red Hollow. It came down from the high, jagged spine of the mountains to the north, gathering speed across miles of scrubby hills and broken shale before it slammed into the valley floor. It carried the taste of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of coming snow. In the summer, it felt like the breath of a furnace. And in the winter, which arrived early and stayed late, it was a knife that sought out every gap in a window frame and every seam in a coat. Red Hollow itself sat in the bottom of this lonely bowl of land like a collection of driftwood thrown up by a tide that had long since receded. It was not a town built on hope, but rather on the stubborn refusal to leave. The main street was a wide scar of rutted earth that turned to gray concrete in the drought and sucking mud in the thaw. Warped wooden sidewalks flanked the street, the boards bleached silver by the sun and polished smooth by the boots of men who walked with their heads down. At the north end of town, the church steeple leaned just slightly to the left, a testament to the prevailing winds and a carpenter who had perhaps indulged too heavily in whiskey during the framing. Opposing it on the south end was the Hanging Rock Saloon, a squat building that exhaled the permanent scent of stale tobacco smoke, spilled rye, and quiet desperation. Between these two poles of salvation and damnation sat the courthouse. It was the only brick building in the county, 2 stories of imposing red clay that looked out of place among the gray timber. It was the seat of law, but everyone in Red Hollow knew it was really a throne room. 5 miles west of where the town petered out into sagebrush, Cade Walker mended a fence line that marked the edge of his property. Cade was a man shaped by the geography he inhabited. He was tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by a lifetime of lifting things that did not want to be moved. His face was a map of exposure, the skin tanned to the color of cured leather and lined deep around the eyes from squinting against the sun. He wore a hat that had lost its original shape 3 years ago, pulled low over eyes that were the color of flint. He gripped the handle of the wire stretcher, the metal cold enough to burn his glove, and pulled the barbed strand tight. It sang a high, thin note in the wind. He stapled it fast to the cedar post with 2 sharp strikes of his hammer, the sound swallowed instantly by the vast silence of the plains. He worked alone. He always worked alone. His spread was modest, a few hundred acres of worn pasture that backed up against a series of rocky gullies and half-dry creek beds. It was hard land. It grew thistles and rocks better than it grew grass. But it was his. The isolation suited him. Out here, the only conversation was the wind hissing through the needle grass and the lowing of his small herd of cattle. Cade straightened his back, feeling the familiar ache in his lumbar. He looked toward the horizon, studying the bruised purple clouds banking up over the mountains. The air felt heavy, charged with static. He had not spoken a word to another human being in 12 days. That was how he liked it. People required explanations. People required pleasantries. The land required only endurance. He mounted his horse, a big bay gelding named Blue, and rode along the ridgeline. He looked at the empty land and saw the ghosts that walked with him. They were always there, quieter now than they had been 10 years ago, but present nonetheless. He saw his mother and father, their faces pale and sweating in the delirium of the typhoid fever that had swept through their sod house when he was 20. He saw his younger brother, barely 10 years old, buried beside them on the small rise overlooking the creek. And then there were the other ghosts, the ones that smelled of black powder and rot, the men he had ridden with in the cavalry during the war between the states. He could still hear the screams of horses at Shiloh and the terrible silence that followed the cannon fire. He had come back from that war with a jagged scar running down his ribs and a hollowness in his chest that nothing seemed to fill. He had tried to fill it once. He thought of Sarah. She had been the daughter of the town banker, a girl with ribbons in her hair and a laugh that sounded like water over stones. They had been betrothed for 6 months. He had started building the main house for her, cutting the timber himself. Then the winter of 1874 had hit, killing half his herd, and the reality of life on the high plains had settled on her like a shroud. She had returned the ring in a letter, having already boarded the stagecoach for St. Louis. She wanted safety. She wanted brick streets and gas lamps. She did not want the wind and the silence. Cade did not blame her. He just stopped building the house. He lived in the small cabin he had originally put up, and he let the timber for the big house rot in the barn. He learned to prefer the honest brutality of the range. A blizzard might kill you, but it would not lie to you. A coyote circling a weak calf was cruel, but it was not malicious. It was just hungry. It was only people who took pleasure in judgment. He checked the sky again. The storm was moving fast. He needed flour and coffee before the weather broke. With a heavy sigh that rattled in his chest, Cade turned blue toward Red Hollow. The ride into town took an hour. As the cluster of buildings rose from the dust, Cade felt his shoulders tense. He adjusted the brim of his hat lower. He rode down the center of the main street, the hooves of his horse clopping loudly on the hard-packed earth. The town was busy with the nervous energy that always preceded a storm. Men were securing shutters and loading wagons hurriedly at the feed store. A group of miners from the hills were arguing in front of the saloon. Cade kept his eyes forward, nodding once to the blacksmith, a man named Thomas, who nodded back with a sooty grimace. As Cade dismounted in front of the general store, a hush seemed to ripple through the street. It was subtle, a lowering of voices, a turning of heads. A buggy was coming down the street. It was not a dusty ranch wagon or a battered buckboard. It was a fine carriage, painted a deep glossy black with red pinstripes, pulled by two matching grays that stepped high and proud. The leather harness shone with polish, and the brass fittings caught the weak afternoon light. Cade tied Blue to the hitching rail and watched. He knew who it was. Everyone knew. Judge Horace Bellamy pulled the team to a halt in front of the courthouse. The judge was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. He was dressed in a suit of severe black wool, tailored to fit his thick frame perfectly. A gold watch chain looped across his vest. His face was broad, his beard trimmed to a spade point, gray streaked with iron. As the judge climbed down from the buggy, men on the sidewalk stopped their conversations. They took off their hats. They bowed their heads. "Good afternoon, Judge," one man called out. "Looks like a hard freeze coming." "Judge," said another. Judge Bellamy nodded to them, a gesture that was royal in its economy. He did not smile. He carried a leather-bound book in one hand and a walking stick in the other. Though he walked with no limp, the stick was for pointing, for emphasizing, for striking surfaces to call for order. "We shall endure it as we endure all trials sent by the Almighty," the judge said. His voice was a deep baritone that carried without effort. It was a voice made for courtrooms and pulpits. "It is the law of nature, just as we follow the law of man." He turned and offered a hand to the passenger remaining in the buggy. Cade had seen Isabel Bellamy from a distance before, usually sitting in the front pew at church on the rare occasions he attended, or riding past in this very carriage. He had never been this close to her. She took the judge's hand and stepped down. The first thing Cade noticed was the silence of her movement. She did not jump or hop. She descended with a fluid, careful grace, as if she were made of something that might shatter if jarred. She was younger than the judge by 20 years, perhaps more. She wore a dress of slate blue wool, plain in cut but made of expensive fabric. It buttoned high to her throat. She wore a hat with a small veil that shadowed the upper part of her face, but Cade could see her chin, pale and delicate, and her mouth, which was set in a straight, expressionless line. She held a woven basket in her gloved hands. She turned to say something to the judge, but he had already turned his back on her to speak to the sheriff, who had hurried out of the courthouse to greet him. Isabel stood there for a moment, untethered, looking at the back of her husband's coat. Then she turned toward the general store. Cade felt a strange compulsion to look away, as if he were witnessing something private, but he did not. He watched her walk toward him. She moved with a rigid posture, her eyes fixed on the boardwalk ahead of her. As she stepped up onto the wooden planks, she looked up and saw Cade standing by the hitching post. For a second, her step faltered. She looked at his worn duster, his scarred boots, the pistol on his hip. She looked at his face. Cade touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said. She nodded. A quick, Jerky motion. "Good day," she whispered. She moved to pass him, intending to enter the store. The boardwalk was uneven there, a board warped upward by years of rain. The toe of her boot caught the edge. It happened in slow motion to Cade's eyes. She pitched forward. Her hands flew out to catch herself. The woven basket slipped from her fingers. It hit the wood and tipped over, spilling a dozen red apples across the dirty planks and down into the dust of the street. Isabel gasped. It was a sound of disproportionate terror, sharp and intake. "Oh, no," she said. "Oh, please." She scrambled to her knees, disregarding the mud on her dress, reaching for the fruit with a frantic urgency. Cade did not think. He dropped to a crouch beside her. He reached out, his large, calloused hand closing over a bright red apple, just as it rolled toward the gutter. "Here," Cade said gently. "I have got it." He held the apple out. Isabel reached for it. Her glove had slipped down, or perhaps the sleeve of her dress had pulled up as she fell. As their hands met, his rough fingers brushing against the soft leather of her palm, he saw it, on the inside of her wrist, just above the glove. The skin was discolored. It was not a fresh mark. It was a sickly, fading yellow-green, the ghost of a severe bruise that was perhaps a week old. It was shaped like the distinct imprint of a thumb. Cade froze. His eyes snapped from her wrist to her face. Isabel saw him looking. She snatched her hand back, yanking the sleeve down with a violent tug. She grabbed the apple and shoved it into the basket. She looked up at him then, and the veil could not hide her eyes. They were wide, the color of burnt umber. Cade expected to see embarrassment. Instead, he saw a raw, naked fear that punched the air from his lungs. Behind the fear was a terrible loneliness, a depth of isolation that mirrored his own, and a flicker of curiosity, a question asked without words. "Who are you?" she seemed to ask. "And why are you looking at me like I am a person?" "You are all right," Cade said, his voice low. It was not a question. Isabel scrambled to her feet. She clutched the basket against her stomach as if it were a shield. "I am fine," she said. Her voice trembled. "I am quite clumsy. My husband tells me so often. Thank you." She did not wait for a reply. She turned and fled into the safety of the general store, the bell above the door jingling with a cheerful sound that felt entirely wrong. Cade stood up slowly. He dusted his knees, though he barely noticed the dirt. The image of that bruise was burned into his mind. It sat there like a splinter under a fingernail, sharp and irritating. He looked toward the courthouse. The judge was still talking to the sheriff, laughing a deep, resonant laugh that sounded like rocks tumbling in a barrel. He looked like the picture of civic virtue. Cade felt a coldness in his gut that had nothing to do with the wind. He walked up the steps to the porch of the general store but did not go inside immediately. Two women were sitting on a bench near the door, wrapped in shawls, their heads bent together. They were fixtures of the town, widows who lived at the boarding house and paid for their keep in gossip. "Did you see that?" "Mrs." Higgins whispered, though her whisper was loud enough to be heard across the street, tripping over her own feet. "Nerves." The second woman, Mrs. Gable, replied with a knowing nod. "The girl has delicate nerves. Always has. It is a burden on the judge." "Bless him." "A burden?" "Mrs." Higgins sniffed. "He has a firm hand, that man, and thank heavens for it. A flighty woman needs a strong rein, just like a horse. If she is bruising herself on door frames and tripping in the street, it is only because she lacks discipline." Cade's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He stood there, staring at a knot in the wood of the wall, bruising herself on door frames. It was a rehearsed line. It was a lie the whole town had agreed to believe because the truth was too inconvenient. A rancher Cade knew slightly, a man named Silas, walked out of the store with a sack of flour on his shoulder. He saw Cade standing there and paused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Afternoon." "Walker." Silas grunted. Cade nodded. "Silas." Silas jerked his head toward the courthouse, where the judge was now holding court on the steps. "See, His Majesty has arrived. He is holding court early." Cade said. "He is always holding court," Silas said, his voice dropping. He settled the water dispute between the millers and the railway yesterday. Guess who won? The railway? Every time, Silas said sourly. Judge quotes the law, quotes the Bible, and somehow the money always ends up on the side of the folks who can buy him a steak dinner. He is a great man. So they say. Never loses an argument, especially not with his wife. Silas laughed, a dry, coughing sound, and walked away toward his wagon. Cade stood still. Everyone knows. He realized. The thought was heavy. The women on the porch, the rancher, the sheriff, they all knew. The bruise he had seen was not a secret. It was part of the town's architecture. Just like the leaning steeple. It was ignored because Judge Bellamy was the law. And in a place this wild, the law was the only thing keeping the wolves at bay, even if the law itself was a wolf. Cade went into the store. He moved through the aisles mechanically, picking up a sack of coffee beans, a bag of flour, a tin of peaches. He saw Isabel at the counter. She was buying thread and a small bag of peppermint candies. She kept her head down, refusing to look at the shopkeeper, refusing to look at anything. Cade paid for his goods and left before she turned around. He could not bear to look at the fear in her eyes again. Not yet. He carried his supplies to Blue and lashed them to the saddle. The wind was picking up now, howling down the street, kicking up dust devils that danced and spun. The sky to the north had turned the color of a fresh bruise, purple and black. He led his horse to the water trough near the side of the courthouse. The water was rippling violently from the wind. Blue lowered his head to drink. Cade leaned against the animal's warm flank, pulling his collar up. He watched the street empty out. People were scuttling indoors like beetles. Footsteps approached. Light, hurried steps. Cade turned. Isabel Bellamy was walking past the trough, clutching a stack of papers in her hand. She was headed toward the courthouse side entrance. A sudden gust of wind, stronger than the rest, tore down the alley. It hit Isabel with physical force. Her skirt whipped around her legs, and the papers threatened to fly from her grasp. She stumbled, reaching out blindly with her free hand. Her palm slapped against the wet wood of the trough to steady herself. She was 3 feet from him. The wind roared in the eaves of the building. Her hat was askew. Strands of dark hair had escaped and were whipping across her face. "Be careful, ma'am," Cade said. He did not shout, but his voice cut through the wind. "It is going to get worse before it gets better." Isabel looked up. She saw him standing there, solid and unmoving against the gale. He looked like part of the land, rooted and immovable. She pushed the hair from her eyes. She looked at the trough, then at him. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," she said. He was surprised she knew his name. He had not introduced himself. "Get inside," Cade said gently. "This storm has teeth." Isabel hesitated. For a moment, she didn't move. She looked at him with that same unguarded expression she had worn in the street. It was a look that said she might prefer the storm to whatever waited for her inside that brick building. "Thank you," she said again. Her voice was low, musical, and terribly sad. Then her eyes flicked upward, over Cade's shoulder. Her expression slammed shut like a door. Cade turned. In the first-floor window of the courthouse, Judge Bellamy was standing. The glass was old and wavy, distorting his features, making him look like a melting wax figure, but his posture was clear. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, watching them. He looked like a carved stone idol, cold and demanding of sacrifice. Isabel pushed herself away from the trough. She ducked her head and hurried toward the door of the courthouse, vanishing inside without looking back. Cade turned back to the window. The judge was still there. He did not acknowledge Cade. He simply watched the spot where his wife had been standing. Cade untied Blue. He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to ride to that window and smash the glass, to shout something, to do something. But he did nothing. He was a rancher with a mortgage and a past full of dead things. Bellamy was the judge. He turned Blue toward the west and spurred him into a trot. The ride home was brutal. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The wind drove grit into his eyes and numbed his fingers inside his gloves. By the time he reached the turnoff for his ranch, the first flakes of snow were cutting through the air, hard and dry like sand. He crested the final rise and looked back toward town. Red Hollow was just a smudge in the distance, a small, wavering cluster of yellow lamplight drowning in a sea of encroaching darkness. It looked fragile. It looked like a lie. Cade thought of the bruise on the wrist of the judge's wife. He thought of the thumbprint. He thought of the way she had looked at the storm, as if she wanted it to take her. He reached his cabin and stabled Blue, rubbing the horse down with extra care, giving him an extra scoop of oats. He barred the barn door against the wind and ran to his cabin. Inside, he lit the kerosene lamp and built up the fire in the potbelly stove. The wind hammered against the log walls, shrieking like a banshee. It was the kind of night that usually made Cade feel grateful for his solitude. He usually sat by the fire, cleaned his rifle, and enjoyed the peace. But tonight, the silence felt different. It felt heavy. He sat in his chair, listening to the wind tear at the roof. He could not get the image out of his head, the yellow mark on the pale skin. He realized with a jolt that he was angry. It was a cold, quiet anger, the kind that had kept him alive during the war. He had spent 10 years building fences to keep the world out. He had convinced himself that what happened in town, what happened to other people, was none of his business. He was a man who minded his own, but as the storm broke fully over the plains, burying the world in white, Cade Walker lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He felt the old wounds in his soul aching in the cold, but for the first time in years, he was not thinking about the past. He was thinking about the woman with the sad eyes and the husband who watched from the window, and he felt a strange, unsettling unraveling in his chest, a sense that the long winter of his own life was about to break. The storm had passed, but it had left its teeth marks on the world. The morning light was gray and thin, filtering through a cloud cover that bruised the sky from horizon to horizon. Cade Walker rode Blue through the lower pasture, the horse's hooves sucking loudly at the thick, clay-heavy mud. The air smelled of wet sage and ozone, a scent that usually signaled relief in this arid country. But today it smelled only of ruin. The wind had been a physical thing, a hammer that had pounded the valley for 16 hours straight. Along the creek bed, the cottonwoods stood like stripped skeletons. The gale had torn the last of the autumn gold from their branches, leaving them bare and black against the sky. Leaves plastered the sides of the gullies like wet paper. Cade pulled his coat collar up against the damp chill. He was looking for a calf, a white-faced Hereford born only 3 days ago. He found where the mother had bedded down in a thicket of scrub oak, the ground trampled and muddy, but the calf was gone. He rode the fence line, or what was left of it. A 1/4 mile of cedar posts had been snapped off at the ground, the barbed wire tangled into a rusted nest that drifted with the tumbleweeds. It would take him a week to fix it. He found the tracks eventually, washed half away by the rain but still visible enough for a man who knew how to read the mud. They were small, cloven prints leading toward the swollen creek. They ended at the water's edge. Cade sat on his horse and watched the brown, churning water rush past. It carried branches and debris, moving with a violence that had not been there 2 days ago. The calf was gone. The land had taken it. He felt a heavy, dull rock settle in his gut. It was not just the loss of the animal, though that cost him money he could not afford to lose. It was the rawness of it all. The storm had scoured everything clean, stripping away the dust and the heat, leaving the world looking flayed. It matched the restless churn inside him, a feeling he had not been able to shake since he had seen the bruise on the wrist of the judge's wife. The land was indifferent. That was what he told himself. It did not care if a calf drowned or a fence broke, but people were different. People made choices. 3 days later, when the roads had dried enough to be passable without sinking to the axles, Cade saddled Blue and rode into Red Hollow. The town looked battered. 2 shingles were missing from the roof of the livery stable, and a large sign for the mercantile lay face down in the mud of the main street. Cade went straight to the sheriff's office. It was a small room attached to the jail, smelling of stale coffee and pipe tobacco. Sheriff Jim Brady sat behind a desk that was scarred by knife marks and cigarette burns. He was a man with a soft face and eyes that always seemed to be looking for an exit. Cade stood before the desk, hat in hand. "I am missing 3 head," Cade said, "not the calf the storm took. 3 full-grown steers. And I am not the only one. Old man Miller lost 5. The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair. The springs squealed in protest. The storm scattered herds. "Cade," the sheriff said, "cows wander. You know that better than I do." "They did not wander 10 miles south against the wind," Cade said, his voice level. "And they did not cut their own fences. I found the wire cut, Jim, clean cuts, and the tracks lead toward the big holding pens on the south ridge." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. He picked up a pen and tapped it against the desk. "The south ridge," he repeated. "That is Bar K land. That is grazing land leased by the investors. Investors who eat dinner with Judge Bellamy every Sunday." Cade said. The sheriff's face hardened. "Now look here. Walker, you are making accusations you cannot prove. The storm was chaos. Cattle get mixed up. If your brands are mixed in with the Bar K herd, they will sort them out come shipping time in the spring." "Spring is 4 months away," Cade said. "If they ship them east before then, I will never see a dime. I cannot go riding onto the Bar K and demanding a count just because you found some cut wire," the sheriff said, his voice rising. "The judge would have my badge for harassment. Those are respectable men." Cade looked at the sheriff for a long moment. He saw the fear there. It was not fear of Cade. It was fear of the man in the brick courthouse across the street. "Respectable," Cade said quietly. He put his hat back on and walked out. The door shut with a rattle of glass. He needed nails to fix the fence. So he walked to the general store. The mood in town was sour. Men were sweeping mud from the boardwalks, their movements angry and sharp. Cade entered the store, the bell jingling above his head. The air inside was thick with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that cut through the windows. It smelled of leather, spices, and kerosene. He did not see her at first. He walked to the back, toward the barrels of hardware. He weighed out 5 pounds of fencing staples and a box of heavy nails. It was only when he turned to take his purchase to the counter that he saw Isabel Bellamy. She was standing by the side window, away from the counter and the other customers. She was not looking at the merchandise. She was staring out through the glass, her gaze fixed on the distant line of hills that rose purple and gray against the horizon. She wore a dark green riding habit, the velvet lush and heavy. She looked entirely out of place among the sacks of grain and farm tools, like a porcelain doll dropped in a toolbox. Cade hesitated. He could have walked to the counter, paid, and left, but he found his feet carrying him toward her. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. She started, her hand flying to her throat. She turned, and for a second, the mask of the judge's wife slipped. She looked young, tired, and profoundly sad. Then she recognized him, and her shoulders lowered an inch. "Mr. Walker," she said. Her voice was soft, barely carrying over the murmur of conversation at the front of the store. "You are looking at the hills," Cade said. "I am," she said. She turned back to the window. "They look so far away, and yet so clear. The air is very clean after the storm." "It washed the dust out," Cade said. "It washed a great deal away," she murmured. She looked at him then. Up close, he could see the fine lines of tension at the corners of her eyes. He could see that the makeup on her left cheek was applied a little thicker than on the right. "How is your ranch, Mr. Walker?" she asked. "Did you fare well?" "I lost a calf," Cade said, "and some fence, but the house stood." "And you?" Isabel asked. "Do you stand?" Cade looked at her. It was a strange question. "I stand," he said. "It is quiet out there. You get used to the wind." Isabel looked down at her gloved hands. "I think I would like the quiet," she said. "In town, there is always noise, even when it is silent. There is the noise of eyes watching you, the noise of expectations." She looked up at him, and her eyes were fierce and wet. "What is it like?" she asked. Living so far out, where there is no one to tell you what to do? Cade thought about the empty nights, the cold stove, the ghosts of his family. But he also thought of the sunrise over the canyon, the hawk circling in the thermal, the absolute truth of the seasons. It is honest, Cade said. Honest. The land does not lie to you, Cade said. If it is going to freeze, it freezes. If the creek runs dry, it runs dry. It can hurt you, ma'am, it can kill you, but it will never look you in the eye and smile while it does it. Isabel stared at him. Her breath hitched in her chest. A silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. The sounds of the store, the clatter of the scale, the voices of men arguing over seed prices seemed to fade away. She took a small step closer to him. In town, she whispered. Lies are very polite. They are well dressed. They hold doors open for you and sit in the front pew at church. Cade felt a tightness in his chest. He wanted to reach out and touch her arm, to offer some kind of comfort, but he kept his hands gripping the sack of nails. Their gazes held. It was a dangerous thing, looking at another man's wife this way, seeing the person beneath the title. Suddenly, a shout from the street shattered the moment. Watch out! Someone screamed. There was a frantic whinny of a horse, the sound of wood splintering, and the heavy thud of hooves on timber. Isabel turned, her face paling. That is our carriage, she said. She ran for the door, and Cade followed. Outside, chaos had erupted. A delivery wagon had dropped a crate of chickens near the hitching rail. The noise and the fluttering birds had spooked the pair of grays harnessed to the judge's fine black buggy. The horses were rearing, their eyes rolling white with panic. There was no driver in the seat. The horses lunged forward, snapping the leather rein that was tied to the post. The buggy lurched violently, slewing sideways toward the deep drainage ditch that ran along the boardwalk. Isabel was standing on the edge of the walk. Oh, she cried out, stepping forward as if to calm the animals. One of the horses kicked out, and the buggy swung around, the wheel catching the edge of the boardwalk. Isabel stumbled back, but the hem of her heavy velvet dress caught on the metal step of the carriage as it swung past. She was yanked off her feet. She did not scream. She simply gasped as she was pulled into the air, thrown off balance, falling toward the hard-packed earth and the churning hooves. Cade moved. He did not think. He simply reacted. He lunged off the boardwalk, diving past the wheel. He caught her. His arm hooked around her waist, and he twisted his body. Taking the impact of the fall on his own shoulder and hip, they hit the dirt hard. Cade rolled, pulling her tight against him to shield her from the buggy wheel that missed them by 6 inches. They came to a stop in the dust. Cade was on his back, and Isabel was sprawled on top of him. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Cade could feel the heat of her body through the layers of her clothing. He could feel the rapid, frantic fluttering of her heart against his chest, like a trapped bird. Her face was inches from his. Her hat had been knocked askew, and a lock of dark hair had fallen across her forehead. Her eyes were wide, staring into his with shock and something else. Relief. He could feel her trembling. His hand was still pressed against the small of her back, holding her safe. Are you hurt? He rasped. Isabel shook her head, unable to speak. No, she breathed. Then a shadow fell over them. Get away from her! The voice was a whip crack. Judge Horace Bellamy was standing over them. He had come from the barber shop, a white towel still tucked into his collar, his face twisted into a mask of pure, white-hot fury. It was not the concern of a husband who had almost lost his wife. It was the rage of a man who saw his property in the dirt, handled by another. Cade released Isabel instantly. He scrambled to his feet, reaching down to help her up, but the judge was faster. Bellamy grabbed Isabel's arm and hauled her to her feet with a force that made her stumble. Thank you, Mr. Walker, the judge said. The words were polite, but the tone was glacial. The judge's eyes were burning. He looked at Cade's dusty clothes, then at the dust on the front of Isabel's dress. He looked at the way Isabel was looking at the rancher. You saved her from a nasty fall, the judge said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch that only they could hear. I am in your debt." He did not look like a man in debt. He looked like a man deciding on a sentence. I was just standing there. "Judge," Cade said, dusting off his hat. "The horse is spooked, indeed." The judge said. He turned to Isabel. He gripped her upper arm, his fingers digging into the velvet sleeve. Cade saw Isabel wince, a tiny, sharp intake of breath, her eyes squeezing shut for a fraction of a second. "Come, Isabel," the judge said through his teeth. "You are making a spectacle." He turned and marched her toward the stunned horses, which had finally been calmed by the stable boy. He did not ask if she was injured. He did not brush the dirt from her skirt. He shoved her toward the carriage door as if she were a recalcitrant child. Cade stood in the street, his chest heaving. He watched them go. He could still feel the imprint of her body against his. He felt a sudden, violent urge to pull the judge down from that carriage and break his jaw. That evening, the Hanging Rock Saloon was full. The storm had kept men indoors for too long, and they were making up for it with whiskey and noise. Cade sat at a small table in the back corner, nursing a single glass of rye. He stared into the amber liquid, watching the light fracture through the glass. "Did you see it?" A voice drifted from the bar. Cade stiffened. It was Silas, the rancher he had seen at the store days ago. He was talking to a group of miners. "Saw what?" asked a miner. "Walker." Silas laughed. "Putting his hands all over the Queen of Red Hollow?" The men laughed. A coarse, ugly sound. "She fell right into his lap," Silas continued, pantomiming a fall. "I tell you, she did not look like she was in a hurry to get up, either. Her hat was in the dirt. Her face was red as a beet. Maybe she is looking for a real man," the miner jeered. "The judge is an old bull. Maybe she needs a young steer to show her the ropes." The laughter grew louder. "Proper lady like that?" Silas scoffed. "But you saw how she looked at him. And the judge. If looks could kill, Walker would be a dead man right now." Cade's hand tightened around his glass until he thought it might shatter. The anger that rose in him was not the cold anger of the war. It was hot and suffocating. It was a fierce protectiveness that surprised him. They were talking about her as if she were a mare to be broken, or a whore to be bought. They knew nothing of the bruise on her wrist or the sadness in her eyes. He slammed the glass down on the table. The sound was not loud, but it was sharp enough that the men at the bar turned to look. Cade stood up. He was taller than most of them, and wider at the shoulder. He looked at Silas. Silas's smile faltered. He cleared his throat and turned back to his drink. The other men suddenly found the bottom of their glasses very interesting. Cade walked out of the saloon. The night air was cold, biting at his face. He felt dirty. He felt dangerous. Over the next 4 days, the unease in Cade's gut hardened into certainty. He was working on the south fence, replacing the wire he was sure the Bar K men had cut. He saw a plume of dust on the road that ran parallel to his property line. He stopped his work and watched. It was the black buggy. The judge was driving. He was moving slowly, stopping every few hundred yards. He would stand up in the carriage, look out over Cade's land, and then write something in a small notebook. He did it on Tuesday. He did it again on Thursday. He was checking the boundaries. He was looking for water rights, for easements, for any crack in the legal armor of Cade's ownership. He was hunting. Cade knew that look. He had seen it on wolves circling a herd. Cade felt a cold sweat on his back. He had drawn the eye of the most powerful man in the territory, simply by catching a woman who was falling. It was late afternoon on Friday when she came. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western mountains, turning the sky into a sheet of burnished gold. To the east, thunderheads were piling up again, dark and bruised, threatening another storm. Cade was in the barn, oiling a harness. He heard the sound of a horse approaching, not a wagon, but a single rider. He stepped out into the yard, wiping his hands on a rag. Isabel Bellamy was riding a roan mare. She rode side saddle, her posture perfect, but the horse looked skittish. She pulled the mare to a halt near the water trough. She looked pale, Her eyes were darting around the yard as if she expected an ambush. "Mr. Walker," she called out. "Mrs. Bellamy," Cade said. He walked toward her. "You are a long way from town." "I visiting the widow Miller," she said. Her voice was thin. "I believe I took a wrong turn at the creek fork. I became turned around." Cade looked at her. The widow Miller lived 5 miles to the north. There was no way to take a wrong turn at the fork and end up here unless you did it on purpose. She was lying, and she was terrified. "I am thirsty," she said, "and my horse is tired. May I trouble you for some water?" Cade nodded slowly. "Of course. Step down." He helped her dismount. Her hands were shaking again. "Come into the barn," he said. "It is cooler out of the wind." He led the mare into the barn and tied her in an empty stall. Isabel followed him. The barn was dim and hushed, the air filled with the smell of sweet hay, leather, and horses. Dust motes floated in the shafts of golden light that pierced the gaps in the siding. Cade pumped a bucket of fresh water and offered her a ladle. She drank greedily, water spilling a little down her chin. She wiped it away with the back of her glove. "You did not visit the widow Miller," Cade said gently. Isabel froze. She lowered the ladle. She looked at him, and her shoulders sagged. "No," she whispered. "I did not." She walked over to a bale of hay and sat down, as if her legs could no longer hold her. I had to leave the house," she said. "The walls were closing in. I felt that if I did not see the sky, I would stop breathing." Cade leaned against a wooden post, watching her. "Why?" Isabel looked at her hands. "I grew up in Boston," she said quietly. "My father was a shipping magnate. We had a large house, servants, parties. Then the panic of '73 hit. We lost everything. My father, he could not bear the shame. He took his own life." Cade stayed silent. He knew about loss. "We were destitute," Isabel continued. "Judge Bellamy was a business associate of my father's. He offered to pay the debts. He offered to take care of my mother and me. All he asked for was a wife." She looked up at Cade. "He is a very important man," she said bitterly. "A moral man. He quotes scripture at breakfast. He tells me that a wife must be submissive, that her body and her mind belong to her husband." She took a shaky breath. "I try to be good," she said. "I try to be perfect. But I am clumsy. I speak when I should be silent. I forget to smile when his friends are there." "And when you forget?" Cade asked. His voice was rough. Isabel's eyes went dark. "Mistakes are corrected," she whispered. "He believes in discipline. He says pain purifies the soul." She did not show him the bruises this time. She did not have to. The way she held herself, the way she flinched at the sound of the wind rattling the roof, told the whole story. Cade felt a rage so pure it almost blinded him. He wanted to ride into town and burn the courthouse to the ground. But he looked at her, sitting there in his barn, so fragile and broken, and the rage turned into something else, something softer. He pushed off the post and walked toward her. "You are safe here, Isabel," he said. She stood up. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Am I?" she asked. She took a step toward him, and her boot caught on an uneven floorboard. She stumbled forward. Cade caught her by the elbows. His grip was firm but gentle. He pulled her upright, but he did not let go. They were standing very close now, between 2 stalls. The air was still. Cade could smell the faint, floral scent of her perfume, lilac, maybe, mixed with the earthy smell of the barn. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Her lips were parted slightly. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. He felt the warmth of her breath on his neck. He saw the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. For a moment, the world stopped. There was no judge, no town, no past. There was only the heat of her skin and the desperate look in her eyes. Isabel leaned in. Just an inch. It was a surrender. It was a plea. Cade felt his own body respond, a magnetic pull that terrified him. He leaned down. His face was inches from hers. He could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to take her in his arms and never let her go back to that house. But he stopped. He pulled back, his hands trembling as he released her elbows. "No," he said. His voice was a harsh croak. "Not like this." Isabel stepped back, her face flushing crimson. She looked confused, hurt, and then ashamed. I must go," she stammered. "It is getting late. The judge. He expects me for dinner." Cade nodded. He could not trust himself to speak. He led her horse out. He helped her mount, his hands burning where they touched her waist. She looked down at him one last time. The sun was setting now, casting long, bruised shadows across the prairie. The world looked vast and lonely. "Thank you for the water, Mr. Walker," she said formally. "Be careful," Cade said. She turned the mare and galloped away, her figure becoming small against the ocean of fading grass. Cade stood in the yard until she was gone. He felt a hollowness in his chest that was worse than anything he had felt after the war. He had done the honorable thing. He had not taken advantage of another man's wife, but as he walked back into the empty barn, he did not feel honorable. He felt sick. He knew now that the judge's house was not just strict, it was a prison, and it was a torture chamber. He went to his cabin, but he could not sleep. He lay on his bunk, listening to the coyotes singing their madness to the moon. He heard the distant rumble of thunder. He imagined Isabel walking into that big silent house at the edge of town. He imagined the door closing behind her. He imagined the heavy drapes and the polished wood, and the man waiting in the parlor with his Bible and his discipline. Cade stared into the dark. His isolation, the silence he had cherished for so long, the distance he had put between himself and the world. It no longer felt like freedom. It felt like a cell, and he was the one who had locked the door. The interior of the Bellamy house was a place where silence went to die. It was not a peaceful silence, but a suffocating weight, pressed down by heavy velvet drapes that shut out the western sun and polished mahogany floors that seemed to hold their breath underfoot. The air was always cold, a chill that radiated from the plaster walls regardless of how high the fire in the parlor grate was stoked. Isabel Bellamy sat at the grand piano, her back rigid. The instrument was a behemoth of black lacquer, shipped all the way from St. Louis at a cost that could have fed a ranch family for 5 years. It was a status symbol, just like the imported china in the cabinet and just like Isabel herself. She was playing a nocturne, the notes floating through the stagnant air of the parlor. Her hands, usually graceful, were trembling. She could feel him standing behind her. Judge Horace Bellamy did not sit when he listened to music. He stood like a sentry, watching the movement of her fingers, his eyes hunting for imperfection. He smelled of bay rum and stale cigar smoke, a scent that made Isabel's stomach turn over. "Tempo, Isabel," the judge said. His voice was low, devoid of warmth. "You are rushing the adagio. It suggests a lack of discipline." Isabel tried to slow her hands. She focused on the sheet music, but the notes seemed to swim before her eyes. She was thinking of the look Cade Walker had given her in the barn 3 days ago. She was thinking of the way he had held her elbows, the way he had almost kissed her. The memory was a dangerous spark in the dry tinder of her mind. She missed a B-flat. It was a small error, a mere slip of the pinky finger. But in the quiet room, it sounded like a scream. The reaction was instantaneous. The judge reached over her shoulder. He did not speak. He simply grabbed the heavy wooden lid of the keyboard and slammed it down. Isabel gasped, jerking her hands back, but she was not fast enough. The heavy wood caught the tips of her fingers on her right hand. The pain was sharp and shocking. A crunch of bone and bruised flesh against ivory keys. She cried out, clutching her hand to her chest, tears springing instantly to her eyes. The judge stared down at her. His face was impassive. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed, as if a favored hunting dog had failed to retrieve a bird. "Pain focuses the mind," the judge said calmly. He walked around the piano and stood in front of her. He looked at her throbbing fingers, already beginning to redden. "You are distracted, Isabel. You have been distracted for weeks. I hear things. I hear whispers in town. Isabel looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What whispers?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking. "That you were seen in the barn of that dirt-stained cowboy." The judge said, he said the word cowboy with the same inflection one might use for vermin, that you were there alone, that you looked at him with something other than the disgust a woman of your station should feel. "It was not like that," Isabel whispered. "I was lost. I needed water." The judge leaned down. He placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a heavy grip, his thumb pressing into the soft hollow of her collarbone. "A judge's wife must be above reproach, Isabel. She must be like Caesar's wife, pure, untouchable. If you allow your name to be dragged through the mud by associating with trash like Cade Walker, you do not just shame yourself, you shame the law. And I am the law." He squeezed harder. Isabel bit her lip to keep from sobbing. "Do not let it happen again." The judge said, "Play it again, and get it right this time." He released her and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Isabel sat on the piano bench, cradling her injured hand. The nails on her index and middle fingers were turning purple. She could not play. She could barely breathe. She stood up and walked to the narrow window that looked out over the back garden, beyond the manicured rose bushes, which were brown and dead for the winter. The land stretched out wild and open. She could see the rolling hills, the scrub brush, the vast indifference of the sky. Out there, the wind blew where it pleased. Out there, a hawk could scream and no one would tell it to be quiet. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The house was a tomb, and she was being buried alive, one day at a time, 5 miles west. The freedom of the open range felt less like a gift and more like a curse. Cade Walker rode along the southern ridge of his property, his eyes fixed on the ground. The wind was whipping his duster around his legs, but he barely felt the cold. He was too angry. He had done a count that morning. 7 head were missing. 7 steers, fat on autumn grass, ready for market. That was nearly $200 walking away on 4 legs. He found the trail in a narrow draw that cut between 2 limestone bluffs. The mud here was frozen hard in the shadows, preserving the evidence. He saw the tracks of the cattle, bunched tight as if driven hard, and the prints of 2 shod horses flanking them. He followed the trail for 3 miles. It led straight to the boundary line of the Double R Ranch. The Double R was owned by Liam O'Connor, a man who sat on the town council and drank brandy with Judge Bellamy every Friday night. The fence had been cut. The wire was snipped clean and pulled back, then hastily twisted together again to look intact from a distance. Cade sat on his horse, staring at the gap. This was not rustling. This was a siege. A rider appeared on the ridge of the Double R land. He sat silhouetted against the gray sky, a rifle resting casually across his saddle horn. It was one of O'Connor's hands, a man named Shorty who had eyes like a ferret. Shorty rode down slowly to meet Cade at the fence line. He did not smile. "Lost something." "Walker?" Shorty asked. "You know what I lost," Cade said. His voice was gravel. "My tracks lead right through your fence." Shorty spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frozen ground. "Cattle wander. Fences break. It is a hard country. The wire was cut," Cade said. Shorty shrugged. Maybe it was old wire. Listen to me, Walker, I am just a hired hand. But I hear things. I hear that you are making enemies of men who can buy and sell this whole valley before breakfast. Is that a threat?" Cade asked. "It is friendly advice," Shorty said. "Some men are untouchable in this town. You push against them, and you are just going to break your own shoulder. Go home, Walker. Count your losses. It is cheaper than a funeral." Shorty turned his horse and rode back up the ridge, disappearing over the crest. Cade watched him go. His hand hovered over the butt of his revolver, but he did not draw. Killing a hired hand would not solve this. The rot came from the head. He turned blue toward town. He rode hard, the anger burning in his gut like a coal. When he walked into the sheriff's office, Jim Brady looked up from a heated game of solitaire. The sheriff looked tired. He looked like a man who was trying very hard not to see things. "I found where they went," Cade said without preamble. He slammed his hand down on the desk. 7-head, driven onto O'Connor's land. The fence was cut. Sheriff Brady flinched. He carefully placed a red jack on a black queen. O'Connor, he muttered. That is a serious accusation. Cade, the tracks are there. Cade said, Go look. Or are you too busy protecting the judge's friends to do your job? Brady stood up, his face flushing. Watch your mouth. Cade, I am the law here. Then act like it, Cade shouted. They are squeezing me out. Jim, you know it. They are stealing my stock, cutting my fences. And we both know who is giving the orders. Brady walked to the window and looked out at the street. He kept his back to Cade. You stepped in it. Cade, he said quietly. That business with the judge's wife. You humiliated him. He is a proud man. He does not forget. So I lose my livelihood because I helped a woman who fell? Cade asked. Brady turned around. His eyes were sad. In this town? Yes. That is exactly how it works. I cannot help you. Cade, if I ride out to O'Connor's place with a warrant, I will be out of a job by sunset, and maybe worse. Cade looked at the star pinned to Brady's chest. It looked tarnished. You are a coward. Jim, Cade said, I am a man with a family to feed. Brady replied, Go home, Cade, before you lose more than just cattle. Cade walked out. The wind hit him in the face, carrying the scent of rain. The sky was turning a sickly green-black. Another storm was coming. The net was tightening around him, and there was nowhere to cut his way out. He did not go home immediately. He rode out of town, but instead of heading west, he circled toward the creek bed that ran behind the church. He needed to think. He needed to be away from the staring eyes of the main street. The creek was dry, a bed of smooth stones and sand lined with twisted willows. It was a place where people rarely went in winter. As he rode through the deepening twilight, he saw a figure walking along the bank. It was a woman. She was walking with frantic, jerky steps, her head down. She wore a heavy gray cloak, but no hat. Her hair was loose, whipping in the rising wind. Cade knew her instantly. It was the way she carried herself, like a bird with a broken wing trying to hide its injury. He spurred Blue forward. When he was 20 yards away, he called out, Mrs. Bellamy? Isabel stopped. She spun around, her hands flying up as if to ward off a blow. When she saw it was him, her arms dropped, but she did not relax. Cade dismounted and walked toward her, leading his horse. As he got closer, he saw that she was shivering violently. It was not just the cold. What are you doing out here? Cade asked gently. The storm is coming. I could not stay in that house, Isabel said. Her voice was brittle. I could not hear the clock ticking one more time. She looked at him, and her eyes were wild. He knows, she said. He knows I came to your ranch. Cade stopped. Who told him? Someone. Everyone. It does not matter. There are no secrets in Red Hollow. She wrapped her arms around herself. He has forbidden me to leave the house without him. She said, I cannot go to church alone. I cannot visit the mercantile. I cannot speak to the washerwoman. He says I am a loose woman. He says I need to be contained. Cade felt the rage surge again, hot and blinding. That is not right, he said. You are not a prisoner. Isabel laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. Am I not? She stepped closer to him. The light was failing, the sky turning a bruised purple. Look at me. Cade, she whispered. She reached up and unbuttoned the top of her cloak. She pulled it open, then unbuttoned the collar of her dress. She pulled the fabric down over her left shoulder. Cade froze. The skin of her shoulder and upper arm was a map of violence. There were bruises in various stages of healing, yellow, green, and a fresh, angry purple mark that looked like the imprint of a cane or a heavy stick. Cade felt the air leave his lungs. It was a physical blow. He had suspected. Yes, but seeing it, seeing the brutality written on her pale skin, was different. He did this? Cade asked. His voice was a whisper. Isabel nodded. She pulled her sleeve up to show her wrist, then pointed to her hand where the nails were black and blue from the piano lid. He calls it correction. She said, He says he is saving my soul." She looked away, toward the dry creek bed. "Last year," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I was with child. I was 4 months along. We had an argument. I do not even remember what it was about. I think I forgot to tell the cook to prepare the roast he liked." She took a breath that rattled in her chest. "He pushed me," she said, "down the main staircase. I fell all the way to the bottom." Cade closed his eyes. He felt sick. "I lost the baby that night," Isabel said. "The doctor came. He is the judge's friend. He told the town I had a weak constitution. He told them I was barren. That is what they all say now. Poor Mrs. Bellamy. She cannot give the judge a son." She looked back at Cade. Her eyes were dry now. She had no tears left. "He killed my child, Cade, and he is the law. Who do I tell? Who will listen to me?" Cade stood there, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. He wanted to kill Horace Bellamy. He wanted to ride to that brick house, kick down the door, and beat the life out of the man with his bare hands. But he knew what would happen. He would be hanged before the sun came up, and Isabel would be left alone, with the shame, with the correction. He reached out. His calloused fingers hovered near the bruise on her shoulder. He wanted to touch it, to heal it, but he was afraid. He was afraid of his own anger, and he was afraid of the terrible, crushing tenderness that was swelling in his chest. "I would kill him for this," Cade said. Isabel looked at his hand, hovering near her skin. Then she looked at his face. "I know," she whispered. "That is why I'm afraid for you." Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like a cannon shot. A split second later, the sky opened up. It did not start as a drizzle. It began as a deluge. Cold, icy rain sheeted down, instantly soaking them. The dust of the creek bed turned to slick mud in seconds. "We have to go," Cade said. He grabbed her cloak and pulled it tight around her. "You cannot go back to town in this. You will freeze before you get there." "Where?" Isabel asked. She was shaking hard now. "My line cabin," Cade said. "It is a mile up the ridge. It is closer than town. Come on." He lifted her onto Blue. She was light, too light. He swung up behind her, wrapping his arms around her to hold the reins. They rode through the storm. The rain lashed at their faces, and the wind tried to tear them from the saddle. But Cade held her tight. He could feel her back pressed against his chest. He could feel the heat of her, the life of her. The line cabin was a small, rough structure built of pine logs, tucked into a grove of scrub oak near the canyon rim. Cade kicked the door open and carried Isabel inside. It was dark and smelled of wood smoke and dry earth. The wind howled outside, hammering against the walls, but inside it was dry. Cade lit a kerosene lantern. The golden light bloomed, revealing a single room with a bunk, a wood stove, and a table. He moved quickly. He got a fire going in the stove, feeding it dry kindling until it roared. He found a tin of coffee and a pot. Isabel stood in the center of the room, dripping water onto the floorboards. She looked lost. "Take that wet cloak off," Cade said. "Here." He pulled a rough wool blanket from the bunk and handed it to her. She fumbled with the buttons, her fingers too numb to work them. Cade stepped forward. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. He unfastened the cloak and the wet outer layer of her dress. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She sank onto the rough wooden chair near the stove, shivering. Cade busied himself with the coffee. He needed to do something with his hands. The space was too small. The intimacy was too sudden. Outside, the storm raged. The rain drummed on the roof like 1,000 fingers. Inside, the fire popped and hissed. "Here," Cade said, handing her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Drink this." Isabel took the cup with both hands. She took a sip, the heat bringing a flush to her pale cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence for a long time. The lantern cast long shadows on the walls. "I feel—" Isabel started, then stopped. "What?" Cade asked. He was leaning against the table, watching her. "I feel like a piece of furniture," she said, "like that piano. He owns me. I am just something to be kept dusted and played when he wants music. And if I am out of tune—" She shuddered. "You are not furniture." Cade said fiercely. "You are flesh and blood. You are strong. Isabel, you survived him pushing you down those stairs. You survived losing your baby. Most women would have broken. I am broken," she said. "No," Cade said. "You are cracked, but you are still standing." He walked over and crouched in front of her chair. He looked up into her face. "I have ghosts too." "Isabel," he said. She looked at him. "I lost my whole family to fever in 1 week." Cade said, "I buried them myself. My brother was 10. I put him in the ground and I felt like God had turned his back on me. Then I went to the war." He looked down at his hands. "I killed men," he said. "I saw things that made me wish I had died with my brother. When I came back, I did not fit anymore. The town, the people, they seemed so small, so petty. I came out here to be alone. I thought if I stayed away from people, I wouldn't get hurt again." He looked up at her. "I was wrong," he said. "Being alone just means you bleed quietly." Isabel reached out. Her hand, the one with the bruised fingers, took his hand. Her skin was warm. "We are both bleeding," she whispered. Her fingers interlaced with his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt electric. It was an anchor in the storm. Isabel leaned forward. She slid off the chair and onto the floor, kneeling in front of him. She pressed her forehead against his chest. Cade froze for a heartbeat. Then his arms came up. He wrapped them around her, pulling her close. He could feel her sobbing, a silent, shaking grief that she had held inside for years. He held her. He rested his chin on the top of her head, smelling the rain and the lilac in her hair. The grief slowly turned into something else. The shaking stopped. The silence in the cabin changed. It became heavy, charged with a static that made the hair on Cade's arms stand up. Isabel lifted her head. Her face was inches from his. Her eyes were dark and searching. "Cade," she breathed. She lifted a hand and touched his cheek. Her thumb traced the scar on his jaw. Cade stared at her. He saw the woman beneath the bruises. He saw the fire that the judge had tried to beat out of her. He brought his hand up and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered on her skin. Isabel's lips parted. Her gaze dropped to his mouth. She leaned in, just a fraction. Cade felt a pull so strong it terrified him. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to lay her down on that bunk and love her until she forgot the name Horace Bellamy. He wanted to claim her, not as property, but as a partner. He leaned in. Their breath mingled. Then, the image of the judge's face flashed in his mind. The power, the law, the trap that was waiting for them. If he crossed this line tonight, there was no going back, and he had no plan to save her yet. He pulled back. It took every ounce of strength he possessed. He stood up abruptly, breaking the contact. He walked to the other side of the room, his back to her, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "We cannot," he said. His voice was rough. Isabel remained kneeling on the floor. She looked at his back. She did not look rejected. She looked understood. "You are right," she whispered. Cade turned around. His eyes were sad. "If I touch you now," he said, "I will not be able to stop. And if we start this, we have to finish it. And I need to know how to keep you alive before I do that." Isabel nodded slowly. She stood up and wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. The night passed in an agonizing blur. Cade insisted she take the bunk. He sat on the chair by the stove, his rifle across his lap. Staring into the flames, he listened to her breathing. Every time she shifted in her sleep, his heart jumped. He was acutely aware of her body just a few feet away. He was acutely aware that for the first time in 10 years, he was not alone in the dark. The storm blew itself out in the early hours of the morning. The wind died, leaving a vast, dripping silence. When dawn broke, the light was cold and steel gray. Cade made more coffee. They drank it standing up, avoiding each other's eyes. "I have to take you back," Cade said. Isabel looked at him. Panic flared in her eyes. "No," she said. "Please, do not make me go back there. Let me stay here. I will hide. I will work." "Isabel," Cade said gently, "if you disappear today, the judge will have a posse out by noon. He will come here first. He will hang me and he will drag you back. We are not ready. I do not care, she cried. I cannot walk back into that house. You have to, Cade said. He grabbed her shoulders. Listen to me. We need a plan. We need to be smart. If we just run now, we die. I will not let you die. He looked into her eyes. I promise you, he said, I will come for you. I will figure this out. But you have to go back today. You have to pretend. Isabel looked at him. She saw the resolve in his face. She nodded, tears spilling over. Okay, she whispered. The ride back to town was a funeral march. The mud was deep, and the air was freezing. They did not speak. When they reached the edge of town, Cade slowed the horse. He rode down the main street, feeling the eyes of the town on them. He did not care anymore. He pulled up in front of the judge's house. The judge was waiting on the porch. He was sitting in a wicker chair, a blanket over his lap, drinking tea. He looked like a king waiting for tribute. He stood up as they approached. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. Cade dismounted and helped Isabel down. She was trembling. She was caught in the storm. Cade said, his voice was flat, I gave her shelter. The judge looked at Cade. Then he looked at Isabel. He saw the blanket she was still clutching. Cade's blanket. Indeed, the judge said, he did not thank Cade. He extended a hand to Isabel. Come inside. Isabel, the judge said. You look terrible. Isabel looked at Cade one last time. It was a look of pure despair. Then she turned and walked up the steps. She took the judge's hand. The judge's fingers closed over hers. He pulled her toward the door. Cade watched the door close. He heard the heavy click of the lock. He stood there in the muddy street, staring at the house. He felt a weight settle on his shoulders that was heavier than the sky. He had just handed her back to the monster. The judge would not forgive this night. Cade knew that. The war had just started, and he had just left his only ally behind enemy lines. He mounted Blue and turned the horse around. As he rode away, he did not look back, but he could feel the judge's gaze burning a hole in his back. He knew that the next time they met, it would not be with words. It would be with blood. The rumor mill in Red Hollow did not need water to grind. It ran on spit and malice. By the time the mud from the storm had dried into a hard, cracked crust along Main Street, the story of what had happened in the line cabin had traveled from the saloon to the church steps, and from the livery stable to the mercantile. It changed shape with every telling, growing darker and more scandalous as it passed through the mouths of the townspeople. They said the judge's wife had ridden out there with intent. They whispered that she was a woman of loose morals who had finally shown her true colors. They said Cade Walker was a predator, a man who had lived like a wolf for so long he had forgotten how to be civilized. No one asked why a woman terrified of thunder would ride 5 miles into the teeth of a gale. No one wondered about the desperation required to flee a warm house for the cold mercy of the open range. It was easier to believe in sin than in suffering. In the Bellamy house, the silence was no longer heavy. It was violent. Isabel Bellamy sat at the vanity table in her bedroom. The mirror reflected a face that was pale and drawn, the eyes rimmed with red. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. She watched in the glass as Judge Horace Bellamy entered the room. He had removed his coat, and his white shirt sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms that were thick with muscle. He looked like a butcher who had just washed his hands. He closed the door quietly. You have made me a laughingstock, Horace said. His voice was conversational, which terrified her more than his shouting. I walk down the street, and men look at their boots. Women stop talking when I pass. They are laughing at me. Isabel, they are saying I cannot control my own house. I did nothing wrong, Isabel said to her reflection. It was the storm. Mr. Walker saved my life. Horace crossed the room in 2 long strides. He grabbed the back of her chair and spun it around. Isabel gasped, clutching the arms of the seat. He saved your life? Horace sneered. Or did he comfort you? Did he offer you the warmth I apparently failed to provide? He was a gentleman, Isabel said, her voice shaking. He slept on a chair. I slept on the bunk. He barely spoke to me. "Do not lie to me. Woman!" Horace roared. His hand lashed out. It was a backhanded slap. Quick and brutal. The force of it knocked Isabel's head to the side. She tasted copper. Her lip had split against her teeth. She brought a hand up to her mouth, staring at him with wide, shocked eyes. "You are an adulteress," Horace hissed, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "In your heart, if not in your body. But I suspect both. A man like that, a savage, does not spend a night alone with a woman like you and spend the time praying." He grabbed her by the throat. It was not a squeeze meant to kill, but to dominate. His thumb pressed against her windpipe, cutting off the air just enough to make the room swim. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. "I should throw you out in the street," Horace whispered. "I should let you rot in the gutter where you belong. But I am a Christian man. I made a vow, and I will keep it, even if I have to beat the devil out of you to do it." He released her. Isabel slumped back in the chair, gasping for air, her hand flying to her bruised neck. "You will not leave this house," Horace said, straightening his cuffs. "You will not speak to anyone, and if I see you look at him again, if I even suspect it, I will kill him. Do you understand?" Isabel nodded, tears streaming down her face. She understood perfectly. But beneath the terror, beneath the throbbing pain in her lip, a small, hard coal of anger began to glow. It was the anger of a trapped animal that realizes it has nothing left to lose. 5 miles west, the war against Cade Walker had moved from whispers to paper. Cade stood by the front gate of his ranch, holding a document that the sheriff's deputy had delivered an hour ago. It was a summons. The paper accused him of 3 counts of cattle rustling and 1 count of criminal trespass on the lands of the Double R Ranch. It was signed by Sheriff Jim Brady, but the handwriting belonged to the court clerk, and the authority behind it belonged to the judge. Cade crumpled the paper in his fist. He looked out at his pasture. Yesterday, he had ridden the north line and found new survey stakes driven into the ground. They were 300 yards inside his original boundary. The markers had moved. According to the new stakes, his best watering hole now belonged to the territory, which meant it was open to claim by anyone, and anyone meant the judge's friends. He threw the saddle on Blue and rode into town. He did not bring his rifle. He knew that if he brought a weapon, he would use it, and that was exactly what they wanted. The hearing was set for 2 days later. When the day arrived, the courtroom was packed. Every bench was filled with townsfolk, ranchers, shopkeepers, and miners squeezed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of unwashed wool, tobacco, and anticipation. They had come for a show. Cade sat at the defendant's table alone. He wore his Sunday suit, which was 10 years old and tied across the shoulders. He kept his hat on his knee. He looked straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the whispers that rippled through the room like wind through dry wheat. "All rise," the bailiff shouted. The room stood. Judge Horace Bellamy swept in from his chambers. He wore his black judicial robes, billowing around him like the wings of a crow. He climbed the steps to the high bench and sat down, his face a mask of granite. He looked out over the courtroom. His eyes passed over Cade as if he were a stain on the floorboards. "Be seated," the judge commanded. The trial was a farce from the opening gavel. The prosecutor was a lawyer from the city named Mr. Eames, a man with a slick mustache and a voice like oil. He called 3 witnesses. The first was Shorty, the hand from the Double R. Shorty swore on the Bible that he had seen Cade driving cattle across the boundary line under the cover of darkness. He lied with a terrifying ease, looking the jury, 6 men chosen by the sheriff, dead in the eye. The second witness was a surveyor who claimed that the original maps of the valley were flawed, and that Cade had been grazing his herd on public land for 5 years illegally. Cade sat through it all. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up. "I have the original deed," Cade said, holding up a worn piece of paper. "It was signed by the territorial governor in 1875. The markers are where they have always been, and I have never stolen a steer in my life. These men are lying." The judge peered over his spectacles. "Mr. Walker," the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This court deals in evidence, not outbursts. The surveyor is a licensed expert. You are a man who lives in a shack. Your denial is noted, but it hardly outweighs the testimony of upstanding citizens." Then the prosecutor called his final witness. The prosecution calls Mrs. Isabel Bellamy to the stand. "Mr." Eames announced. A hush fell over the room, so complete that the sound of a boot scraping against the floor sounded like a gunshot. Cade stiffened. He turned to watch the side door. Isabel walked in. She was dressed in black, a veil covering the upper half of her face. She moved stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not look at the crowd. She walked to the witness box and sat down. "Mr." Eames approached her gently. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "We apologize for the distress. We only wish to establish the character of the defendant. Is it true that on the night of November 12th, you were stranded in a storm and sought shelter in the defendant's cabin?" Isabel's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, and were you alone with him?" "Yes, Mr." Eames paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The crowd murmured. "Did the defendant touch you?" Eames asked. "Did he behave in a manner that was improper?" Cade held his breath. He looked at Isabel. She was gripping the railing of the witness box so hard her knuckles were white. The judge was leaning forward, his eyes boring into her. It was a warning. "Remember who holds the leash." Isabel lifted her head. Through the mesh of the veil, her eyes found Cade's. For a second, he saw the fear. Then he saw something else. "No," she said clearly. The crowd quieted. "Mr. Walker was a perfect gentleman," Isabel said. Her voice gained strength. "He gave me his blanket. He slept on the floor. He showed me nothing but respect, more respect than I have received from many others." She turned her head and looked directly at the judge. "He did not touch me," she said. "He saved me." The judge's face went purple. A vein throbbed in his temple. He had wanted her to cry. He had wanted her to act the victim, to paint Cade as a brute so he could destroy him with the full blessing of the town. Instead, she had defended him. The judge slammed his gavel down. The crack was deafening. "That is enough," the judge roared. "The witness is clearly distraught. Step down, Mrs. Bellamy." Isabel stood up. She did not look at her husband. She walked out of the courtroom with her head high, though Cade could see the tremor in her hands. The judge turned his gaze on Cade. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He could not hang Cade for rustling without better proof, not after Isabel's testimony had cast Cade as a hero, but he could still hurt him. "The court finds the defendant guilty of grazing violations and negligence," the judge announced. "You are fined $500. Furthermore, the disputed cattle are to be seized by the territory until proper ownership can be established. And let the record show that Mr. Walker is designated a disturber of the peace. Any further infractions will result in immediate imprisonment." $500 was a fortune. It was everything Cade had saved for winter feed and supplies. It was a death sentence for his ranch. He walked out of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun. He felt hollowed out. The fine was legal on paper. The seizure was legal on paper. But everyone knew what it was. It was a boot on his neck. Cade rode back to his ranch in a daze. He sat on his porch as the sun went down. Watching the shadows lengthen across the grass he was no longer sure he owned. He saw riders on the horizon, Bar K men, checking the new fences, counting his herd. They were waiting for him to starve or leave. He realized then that the judge did not just want to win. He wanted to crush Cade into the dirt until there was nothing left but a memory. 3 days later, the violence arrived at his doorstep. Cade had hired a drifter named Thomas to help with the winter feeding. Thomas was an old man, harmless and hard-working. When Cade came out of his cabin at dawn, he found Thomas lying in the dirt in front of the barn. Thomas's face was a ruin. One eye was swollen shut, and his arm was bent at a sickening angle. Cade rushed to him, kneeling in the dust. "Thomas, who did this?" Thomas groaned, spitting blood. "3 men," he wheezed, "wore masks. Said to tell you that next time it will be you." Said the town does not want trash like you around. Said they're going to drive you out for good. Cade carried the old man inside and set his arm as best he could. He washed the blood from Thomas's face, his own hands shaking not with fear, but with a cold, murderous resolve. He sat by the window, cleaning his Winchester rifle. He looked at the legal papers on his table. The fines, the summons, the threats. They were useless. The law was a weapon, and it was in the hands of his enemy. There was no sheriff coming to help. There was no appeal. There was only the land, and the man willing to hold it. In town, the cage was getting smaller, but the bird was fighting back. Isabel Bellamy stopped wearing the heavy powder she used to hide her husband's corrections. On Sunday morning, she walked into church with a bruise blooming on her cheekbone like a dark flower. She held her hymnal steady, singing the verses in a clear voice while the women in the pew behind her whispered and pointed. When the baker's wife made a snide comment about her adventures in the storm, Isabel did not look down. She turned and looked the woman in the eye. "My conscience is clear, Mrs. Gable," Isabel said calmly. "Is yours?" The woman sputtered and turned away. Isabel went home and sat at her desk. She wrote a letter to her cousin in Philadelphia, a man who was a lawyer. She poured out everything, the abuse, the stolen land, the trap she was in. She begged for help. She begged for a train ticket. She folded the letter and sealed it with wax. Then she sat there, staring at the envelope. She thought of the postmaster, Mr. Abernathy. He played chess with the judge. He owed the judge money. The letter would never leave Red Hollow. It would go straight to Horace's desk, and the punishment for trying to run away would be severe. Isabel picked up the letter. She tore it in half, then she tore it again and again, until it was just a pile of confetti on the polished wood of the desk. She swept the pieces into the fire. She watched them burn, curling into black ash. She realized then that no one was coming to save her. That night, the argument started over nothing. The soup was too cold. The judge was in a foul mood because Cade had paid the fine. He had sold his mother's jewelry to do it, and was still on his land. Horace grabbed Isabel by the hair and dragged her into the hallway. He threw her against the wall. "You are defiant," he spat. "I see it in your eyes. You think you have won because you lied for him in court? You have won nothing. I will break him, Isabel, and then I will break you." He stormed into his study and slammed the door. Isabel lay on the floor for a long time. She listened to the house. It was silent. She stood up. She did not pack a bag. She did not put on her riding habit. She simply walked out the back door, wearing her plain gray dress and a heavy shawl. She went to the stable, saddled the mare with trembling hands, and led the horse quietly into the alley. There was no storm tonight. The sky was a vast dome of velvet, pierced by a million stars that burned with a cold, white fire. The wind was biting, but the air was still. She rode west. She did not run the horse. She let it walk, picking its way over the frozen ruts. She was not running away in panic this time. She was riding toward a decision. When she reached Cade's ranch, the cabin was dark. A single curl of smoke rose from the chimney, painting a gray line against the stars. She knocked on the door. It opened instantly. Cade stood there, his rifle in his hand. When he saw it was her, he lowered the weapon. He pulled her inside and shut the door quickly. "Isabel," he said, "are you hurt?" He led her to the fire. He turned up the lamp. He saw the bruise on her cheek, the way she held herself. "No more than usual," she said quietly. She turned to face him. The cabin was warm, smelling of coffee and gun oil. It felt like the only safe place in the world. "Why did you come?" Cade asked. "It is dangerous. If he finds you gone—" "He will kill me," Isabel said. "Or he will kill the part of me that is still human." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "I cannot stay there." "Cade, I thought I could bear it for the sake of appearances, or fear, or duty. But I cannot. If I stay, I will die. Maybe not my body, but my soul will wither up and blow away like dust." Cade looked at her. He saw the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes that the judge had not been able to extinguish. He stepped closer. I paid the fine. He said, I sold everything I had of value, but I paid it. I thought it would buy us time. But Thomas was beaten today. They are not going to stop. No, Isabel said. They will never stop. Not as long as he has the power. The air between them changed. It became charged, heavy with the things they had not said in the storm. Isabel took a step toward him. I lie in that bed at night, she whispered, and I try to pray. But I do not pray for forgiveness. I pray for you. I think of your hands on me. I think of the way you looked at me when I fell. Cade felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Isabel, I felt safe with you, she said. In the middle of a storm, in a cold cabin, I felt safer than I have ever felt in my life. Cade dropped his rifle. It clattered onto the floor. He reached out and took her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones. I dream of you, he confessed. His voice was rough with emotion. I hear your voice in the wind. I look at the land, and I see it the way you saw it, like it promised something better. I wanted to be the man who gave that to you. You are that man, Isabel said. She leaned into his touch. They stood there, holding each other, the desire rising like a flood. It was not just physical need. It was a desperate, starving hunger for connection. They were two people who had been hollowed out by the world, trying to fill each other up. Cade pulled her against him. He buried his face in her hair. We cannot hide this, he said into her ear. If we run, they will hunt us down, Isabel said. You know that? He will send men to every corner of the territory. We will be fugitives. Cade pulled back. He looked into her eyes. He saw the terror there, but he also saw the trust. I am done running, Cade said, and I am done hiding. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark prairie. If I hide you here, he will come with a warrant and a posse. He will burn this place down. If we run tonight, we look like guilty sinners fleeing judgment. What do we do? Isabel asked. Cade turned around. His face was hard, set in lines of iron determination. We take it to them, he said. Isabel looked confused. How? Sunday, Cade said. The whole town will be at the service. The judge will be there, sitting in the front row, pretending to be a saint. The sheriff, the shopkeepers, the people who whisper about you, they will all be there. He walked back to her. I am going to ride in there, he said, and I am going to take you, not in the dark, not in secret. I am going to walk into that church and take you by the hand in front of God and everyone. Isabel's eyes widened. Cade, that is madness. They will kill you. Maybe, Cade said, but we have to shatter the lie. Isabel, we have to show them exactly what he is. We have to show them that you are not his property. If we steal away in the night, we are just thieves. If we do it in the light, we are declaring war. He gripped her shoulders. It will ruin you, he said. In their eyes, you will be a fallen woman. You will never be respectable again. Isabel looked at him. She thought of the polished floors, the piano lid slamming down, the cold eyes of the man who owned her. She thought of the respectability that allowed a town to ignore a woman's screams. Let them look, she whispered. Let them see. I would rather be ruined and free than respectable and dead. She reached up and kissed him. It was a brief, fierce pressing of lips, a seal on a pact. Go, Cade said. Ride back. Be in that pew on Sunday. I will be there, she said. She slipped out into the night. Cade watched her ride away until the darkness swallowed her. He stood in the doorway for a long time, feeling the wind pick up. It was carrying dust from the north. He turned back into the cabin. He picked up his rifle from the floor. He sat down at the table and pulled a box of ammunition from the drawer. He began to load the weapon. Click, click, click. The sound was loud in the small room. He looked at the small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. He saw a man with a scar on his face and gray in his beard. He saw a man who had lost everything once and was about to risk everything again. He knew that what he was planning was suicide. He knew the town would brand him a monster. They would say he stole the judge's wife. They would say he was the devil. Let them say it. Cade Walker checked the action of the rifle one last time. He set it by the door. He blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, waiting for Sunday. The wind howled outside, indifferent to the sins of men, blowing across a land that demanded blood for every inch of freedom. Sunday morning in Red Hollow arrived with a clarity that felt punitive. The sky was a hard, relentless blue, stretching from one jagged horizon to the other without a single cloud to soften the glare. It was the kind of morning where the air was so dry it cracked the lips, and the dust that swirled in thin, restless spirals along the main street tasted of ancient earth and pulverized bone. The bell in the leaning steeple of the church began to toll. It was a flat, clanging sound that summoned the faithful and the fearful alike. Inside the small, white-clapboard building, the air was already stifling. The windows were cracked open, but they admitted only the smell of sagebrush and the heat that was already rising from the baking earth. The pews were packed. Women sat in their best calico and silk, fans moving in a rhythmic, synchronized flutter like the wings of nervous moths. Men sat stiffly in brushed coats that smelled of mothballs and tobacco, their hats resting on their knees, their face scrubbed pink and raw. Children fidgeted, their boots scuffing against the pine floorboards, silenced occasionally by a sharp pinch or a stern glare from a mother. In the very front pew, on the right side of the aisle, the side reserved for the pillars of the community, sat Judge Horace Bellamy. He was a monument to righteousness. His black coat was impeccable, his white collar starched so stiff it looked like porcelain. He sat with his spine not touching the back of the pew, his head held high, his hands resting on the silver head of his cane. He looked like a man who had personally negotiated the terms of salvation with the Almighty and was satisfied with the contract. Beside him sat Isabel. She wore a dress of severe charcoal gray, buttoned to her chin. Her hands were folded in her lap, the fingers laced together so tightly that the knuckles were the color of old parchment. She was staring at the wooden cross hanging behind the pulpit, but she did not see it. Her vision was tunneled, gray at the edges. Her heart was beating a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird hurling itself against the bars of a cage. Every beat felt like a stone being placed on her chest, adding to a weight that threatened to stop her breath entirely. Reverend Thomas Miller stood at the pulpit. He was a thin man with a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering over rock. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief and leaned forward. "Order," the Reverend intoned, his voice rising. "Order is the first law of heaven. Without order, there is chaos. Without the fence, the herd scatters. Without the law, the man becomes a beast." The congregation murmured their agreement. "We live in a wild land." The Reverend continued. "The devil walks in the wilderness. He tempts us with freedom. He whispers that we may do as we please. But I tell you, the path of the righteous is a narrow path. It is a path of obedience. Obedience to the law. Obedience to the family. Obedience to the husband." Isabel felt the judge shift beside her. He nodded, a slow, deep movement of approval. He was the living symbol of that order. He was the fence. He was the law. And she was the beast that needed to be corralled. She closed her eyes. She could feel the bruise on her shoulder throbbing in time with her pulse. She wondered if she would die today. She wondered if Cade would come. A part of her, the part that was terrified and broken, hoped he would stay away, that he would ride for the territory and save himself. But another part, a fierce, starving part, was praying for the sound of hoofbeats. 300 yards south of town, behind the low ridge that marked the old creek bed, Cade Walker sat on his horse. Blue was stamping impatiently, tossing his head against the bit. The horse could sense the tension radiating from the man in the saddle. Cade reached down and stroked the animal's neck, his hand steady, though his stomach was churning with a nausea that tasted of acid and fear. He checked his Winchester rifle for the third time. The brass cartridges gleamed in the sun. He slid the weapon back into the leather scabbard, but he left the strap undone. He looked at the town. From here, it looked small and insignificant, a scattering of wooden boxes dropped on the vast face of the prairie. But he knew the power those boxes held. He knew the crushing weight of the judgment that lived inside them. He thought of the night in the cabin. He thought of the way Isabel had looked in the firelight, her face stripped of all the masks she was forced to wear. He thought of the bruises on her skin, the yellow, the green, the purple, a map of her suffering drawn by the hand of the man who sat in the front pew. He thought of his own family, buried on the hill. They had died of fever, a natural cruelty. What was happening to Isabel was not natural, it was a sin. The church bell had stopped ringing. The hymn would be starting soon. Cade took a deep breath. The air was hot in his lungs. He knew that what he was about to do would destroy his life. He would never mend a fence in this valley again. He would never sit on his porch and watch the sun go down over land that was his. He was about to become an outlaw, a monster. He did not care. He gathered the reins in his left hand. He pulled his hat down tight. "Let us go, Blue," he whispered. He dug his spurs into the horse's flanks. Blue surged forward, launching himself up the side of the ridge. They crested the hill and hit the flat, hard-packed earth of the road leading into town. Cade leaned forward, urging the horse to a full gallop. The sound of the hooves changed as they hit the main street. It was a thunderous, rhythmic pounding that echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. Dust exploded behind them, a billowing cloud of tan choke. People loitering outside the saloon turned in alarm. A dog barked wildly and scrambled out of the way. Cade did not slow down. He rode straight down the center of the street, his eyes fixed on the open doors of the church. He was a blur of motion. A man, a horse, a cloud of dust, coming like the storm itself. Inside the church, they were singing Rock of Ages. The voices were thin and reedy, struggling against the heat. Rock of Ages, cleft for me. The sound of the approaching horse cut through the hymn. It grew louder, a rolling drumbeat that vibrated in the floorboards. Heads began to turn. The singing faltered. Cade reined Blue in sharply right at the steps of the church. The horse reared, its iron-shod hooves flashing in the sunlight. Gravel sprang across the porch. The animal screamed, a wild, piercing sound that shattered the Sunday morning peace. Cade vaulted from the saddle before the horse had even settled. He landed hard, dust puffing around his boots. He grabbed his rifle from the scabbard in one fluid motion. He strode up the 3 wooden steps. He kicked the double doors fully open. They banged against the interior walls with a crack like a pistol shot. The singing died instantly. The organist froze, her hands hovering over the keys. Cade Walker stood in the doorway. He was silhouetted against the blinding white light of the outside world, a dark, menacing figure. He was covered in dust. His hat was pulled low. He held the rifle in his right hand, the barrel pointing at the floor, but his grip was white-knuckled. Gasps rippled through the pews. It was a sound like a sudden intake of breath from a single, giant lung. Cade stepped inside. His spurs jingled, a harsh, metallic sound in the holy silence. He walked down the center aisle. His eyes were blazing with a cold, blue fire. He did not look at the sheriff. He did not look at the reverend. He looked straight at the front pew. "Isabel," he said. His voice rang through the wooden rafters. It was not a shout, but it carried to every corner of the room. It was raw and commanding. "Stand up, Isabel. Come with me." The room fell dead silent. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Every eye in the church turned to the judge's wife. Isabel felt the blood drain from her face. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He had come. He had actually come. She stood up. Her legs were shaking so badly she had to grab the back of the pew in front of her to keep from falling. She stepped into the aisle. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her skin, burning like brands. She took one step toward him. "Sit down!" The judge was on his feet. His face was flushing a deep, dangerous red. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He reached out and grabbed Isabel's arm. His fingers dug into her flesh, right over the fresh bruise he'd given her 2 nights ago. "You belong to me," he snarled. His voice was a low rumble of fury. "You are my wife. You do not move unless I tell you to move," Isabel cried out, a small, sharp sound of pain. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Cade stopped. He was 10 feet away. He raised the rifle. He did not point it at the judge's head. He pointed the black, unwavering eye of the barrel directly at the judge's hand, the hand that was crushing Isabel's arm. "Let her go," Cade said. The tone was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted that he was going to hell and was just attending to details. "If you do not take your hand off her, Judge, I will take it off for you." The judge froze. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Cade's face. He saw no hesitation there. He saw only the absolute certainty of violence. The judge's hand dropped toward his coat pocket, where everyone knew he carried a derringer. "Do not do it," Cade warned. "You are not fast enough. Not today." The tension in the room was pulled so tight, it hummed. The sheriff, sitting 3 rows back, half rose, his hand moving to his holster. Cade did not even look at him. "I said let her go." The judge looked at the townspeople watching him. He saw their shock. He saw their fear. He realized that if he pushed this, he would die in front of his congregation. He released Isabel. He shoved her slightly, a gesture of contempt. "Go to your whore." Then the judge spat. His eyes were full of murderous hatred. Isabel stumbled forward. She ran the few steps to Cade. She did not hide behind him. She stood before him, trembling, her chest heaving. Cade looked down at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the relief. He shifted the rifle to his left hand, holding it by the barrel, keeping it ready. Then he did the thing that would be talked about in Red Hollow for 50 years. He reached out with his right arm and hooked it around Isabel's waist. He pulled her against him, hard. Her body collided with his, the dust of the trail meeting the starch of her Sunday dress. He looked at her for 1 heartbeat, and then he kissed her. It was not a polite kiss. It was not a kiss of greeting. It was a claiming. It was fiercely tender and full of a hunger that had been suppressed for too long. He pressed his mouth to hers, and she responded, her hands coming up to clutch the lapels of his dusty coat, her body arching into his. It was a public declaration. It was a rejection of every law, every social rule, every boundary the town had erected. It shouted that she was not property. It shouted that she was a woman, and that she was loved. The reaction was instantaneous. Mrs. Higgins, in the 3rd row, gasped loud enough to be heard in the choir loft and covered her mouth with both hands. "An abomination!" Reverend Miller cried out, clutching his Bible. "This is the house of God!" men shouted in outrage. "Get him!" someone yelled. "That is the judge's wife!" The judge roared. It was a sound of pure, animal rage. "You have defiled her! You are a dead man! Walker!" Cade broke the kiss. He did not let go of Isabel. He kept his arm around her waist, holding her up, holding her close. He turned to face the crowd. "Defiled?" Cade shouted. His voice shook, but not with fear. It shook with the force of his conviction. "You talk about defilement? You sit here in your Sunday best and you listen to sermons about order?" He pointed a shaking finger at the marks on Isabel's wrist, which were visible where her sleeve had pulled up. "Look!" Cade demanded. "Look at her!" He gestured to her face, to the faint shadow of the bruise on her cheek. "He beats her!" Cade yelled. "He threw her down the stairs and killed her child. He bruises her body and he breaks her spirit, and you all know it. He scanned the faces in the pews. He saw Silas, the rancher. He saw the baker's wife. He saw the sheriff. You know it. Cade accused them. You see the bruises and you look away. You hear the screams and you talk about delicate nerves. You let this man treat a human being like a dog because he holds the gavel." Many of the townspeople averted their eyes. They looked at the floor. They looked at their hymnals. Shame, hot and prickly, moved through the room. But a few stared, stricken. A young woman near the back looked at Isabel with tears in her eyes. "He is the monster!" Cade shouted, pointing the barrel of his rifle at the judge. "Not me. I am just the man who is taking her out of hell." "That is enough," the sheriff shouted, finally drawing his weapon. Chaos erupted. Men were scrambling over pews. Women were screaming and pulling children under the benches. Cade stepped back, pulling Isabel with him. He moved toward the open doors. "Come on," he whispered to her. Isabel was clinging to his arm. Her face was burning with shame, but beneath the shame was something new. A fire, a defiance. She looked at the judge, who was shaking with impotent fury, and she realized he could not touch her. She was outside the circle now. She was gone. "Back off!" Cade yelled at the advancing men. He raised the rifle again. He backed through the doors, out into the blinding sunlight. The air felt clean after the stagnation of the church. They ran to Blue. The horse was dancing sideways, spooked by the noise from inside. Cade swung into the saddle. He reached down. Isabel grabbed his forearm, with a strength born of adrenaline. He swung her up behind him. "Hold on!" Cade shouted. Isabel wrapped her arms around his waist. She pressed her face against the dusty back of his coat. She could feel the muscles of his back bunching. Cade wheeled the horse around. He looked back at the church doors. The sheriff and half a dozen men were spilling out onto the porch, guns drawn. "If you want her back," Cade yelled, his voice cracking, "you will have to shoot me off this horse." For a second, no one fired. The sight of the judge's wife on the back of the outlaw's horse, her dress billowing in the wind, froze them. Then, the judge pushed through the crowd. "Shoot him!" the judge screamed. "Shoot the bastard!" Cade kicked Blue into a gallop. The horse launched itself down the street. A gunshot cracked, then another. Isabel screamed, burying her face in Cade's coat. She heard the angry buzz of a bullet passing near her ear. She saw a puff of dust kick up near the horse's front hooves. "Faster! Blue!" Cade yelled. They raced past the saloon, past the livery, past the last few shacks of Red Hollow. The wind roared in their ears. Behind them, the town was an anthill that had been kicked over. "Get the horses!" The judge was screaming in the distance. "I want a posse! I want them hanged!" Cade did not look back. He drove the horse hard, leaving the road and cutting across the open sagebrush. He headed for the broken hills to the west, the Badlands where the terrain was a nightmare of twisted rock and deep arroyos. They rode for hours. The sun beat down on them, turning the world into an anvil. The horse lathered, its breathing ragged. Cade kept a punishing pace until the town was nothing but a blur of heat haze on the horizon. And then he pushed farther. They entered the broken country. The land rose up in jagged spines of red rock, the vegetation thin to scrub cedar and cactus. It was a brutal, silent place. The sense of freedom was intoxicating, but it fought a war with the terror of what they had done. They were fugitives now. There was no going back. The life Isabel had known, the tea parties, the piano lessons, the terror, was gone. The life Cade had known, the quiet ranch, the fences, the solitude, was gone. The sun began to dip, painting the rocks in shades of blood and violet. The temperature dropped, plummeting as soon as the light failed. "We have to stop," Cade said, his voice raspy with dust. "The horse is done." They found a shallow overhang beneath a limestone ridge. It offered protection from the wind on 3 sides. Cade dismounted and helped Isabel down. Her legs buckled when she hit the ground. He caught her and lowered her gently to a sitting position against the rock. She looked at him. Her face was streaked with dust and tears. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung wild around her shoulders. The gray dress was torn at the hem. She looked beautiful. Cade tended to the horse first, rubbing him down with a handful of dry grass, whispering apologies to the animal. Then he gathered dead wood from the scrub brush and built a small fire in the shelter of the overhang. They huddled close to the flames. The night air was biting, a sharp reminder that winter was not far off. Cade opened his saddlebags. He had a canteen, some jerky, and a small flask of whiskey. He poured some water onto a rag and reached for Isabel's hand. "You are bleeding," he said softly. A bullet had grazed her forearm, just a scratch, but the blood had dried on her sleeve. He rolled up the fabric and cleaned the wound. The sting made her hiss, but she did not pull away. He had scraped his palms raw on the reins and the saddle horn. She took the rag from him and cleaned his hands in turn. They sat in silence for a long time, eating the tough meat, staring into the fire. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a vast, hollow exhaustion. Isabel started to shake. It began in her hands and spread to her whole body until her teeth were chattering. "I am so afraid," she whispered. Cade moved closer. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders over her own shawl. "I know," he said. "They are coming." She said, "He will never stop. He will hunt us until we are dead." "I know," Cade repeated. Isabel looked up at him. The firelight danced in her dark eyes. "But I feel—" She struggled for the word. "I feel like I just took my first breath of air." She let out a sob that was half a laugh. "Did you see his face?" she asked. "When you kissed me, I saw it," Cade said. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I felt guilty," Isabel confessed. "For a moment, I felt like a sinner, like everything he said about me was true. You are not a sinner, Isabel," Cade said fiercely. "You are a survivor." He knelt before her on the hard ground. "I would do it again," he said. "I would ride into that church 1,000 times. I would scream the truth until my throat bled. Because at least now they know. At least now the lie is dead." He looked at her mouth. "I meant it," he said. "When I kissed you—" Isabel reached out. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, pulling him toward her. "I know," she whispered. "I meant it too." The dam broke. It was not a slow, gentle coming together. It was a collision. Isabel threw herself at him, and Cade caught her. They clung to each other with a desperation that was terrifying. He kissed her, and this time there was no audience, no performance. There was only the taste of dust and whiskey and salt tears. His hands, rough and scarred, cradled her face as if she were made of glass. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel the reality of him. The intimacy that followed was intense and consuming. It was not soft. It was rooted in the adrenaline of the escape, the shared pain of their pasts, and the knowledge that they might not live to see the end of the week. It was a frantic affirmation that they were alive, that they were chosen, that they belonged to themselves and to each other, under the cold, indifferent stars, on the hard ground of a canyon floor. They took comfort in the only thing they had left, each other. Later, the fire burned down to a bed of glowing coals. They lay wrapped together in the blankets, Cade's back against the rock, Isabel curled against his chest. The wind moaned through the canyon, a lonely, hollow sound. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped and howled, a sound of wildness and hunger. Cade tightened his arm around Isabel. He could feel her steady breathing. She was asleep, exhausted. He stared out into the darkness. He knew what was out there. The judge, the posse, the rope, the land itself, which would try to freeze them and starve them. But as he looked down at the woman sleeping in his arms, Cade felt a strange peace settle over him. He had lost his ranch. He had lost his good name. He had likely forfeited his life. But he had saved her. And for the first time in 10 years, the ghosts of his past were silent. They had been replaced by a living, breathing warmth. The future was a dark road, but they would walk it together. The sun did not rise over Red Hollow the morning after the church incident so much as it bled into the sky. A cold, pale hemorrhage of light that offered no warmth. The frost lay heavy on the buffalo grass, turning the world into a landscape of brittle silver. Judge Horace Bellamy sat atop his black stallion in front of the livery stable. He looked like a general inspecting his troops before a massacre. He had gathered a posse of 12 men. Some were deputies, bound by oath and wage. Others were men who owed the judge money, or favors, or simply feared him enough to ride into the Badlands at his command. The judge wore a heavy buffalo hide coat, and his eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness and a cold, manic fury. He addressed the men not as a husband seeking a wife, but as a patriarch seeking to restore order to a rebellious world. "Gentlemen," the judge said, his voice cutting through the steam of the horse's breath, "we ride to correct a grave injustice. That man, that animal walker, has taken a woman who is not in her right mind. He has kidnapped her. He has confused her with lies and likely drugged her." He paused, letting his gaze drift over the men, ensuring their loyalty. "Do not be fooled by what you saw in the church," the judge continued. "That was hysteria. That was a woman broken by fear of a predator. We bring her home. As for Walker, if he resists, and he will resist, you shoot to kill. The territory will be better off without him." The men nodded. They checked their cinches and their rifles. The story was already twisting in their minds, shaped by the judge's conviction. By the time they rode out, hooves thundering against the frozen earth, the narrative had solidified. Cade Walker was a monster who had snatched a delicate flower, and they were the knights riding to salvage her honor. 20 miles west, the land had stripped away all pretense of civilization. Cade and Isabel were deep in the broken country now. It was a chaotic jumble of red rock spires, deep, sunless ravines, and narrow canyons where the wind screamed like a dying thing. It was terrain that could break a horse's leg in a heartbeat or hide a man for 100 years if he knew where the water was. They were moving slowly. Blue. The sturdy bay gelding was carrying double weight over ground that was never meant for horses. His head hung low, and his breathing was a ragged rasp in the thin air. Cade walked beside the horse to spare the animal, his boots slipping on the shale. He led them up a narrow game trail that wound along the spine of a ridge. The wind here was ferocious, tearing at their clothes, stinging their eyes with grit. Isabel rode with her head bowed against the gale. She wore Cade's duster coat, which swallowed her small frame. Her face was smudged with charcoal from their fires and streaked with dust, but her eyes were alert. She scanned the horizon constantly, looking for the telltale plume of dust that would signal the posse. They were thirsty. They had found a small seep of water the day before, barely enough to fill the canteen and wet the horse's tongue, their stomachs cramped with hunger. The jerky was gone. They were surviving on willpower and the terrifying momentum of their escape. But in this crucible, something remarkable was happening. The porcelain doll was cracking, and the woman underneath was emerging, hard and bright as a diamond. That afternoon, they stopped in a box canyon to rest the horse. Cade sat heavily on a rock, his face gray with exhaustion. He watched Isabel. She did not sit. She gathered dried sagebrush and dead cedar branches, her movements efficient. She pulled the matches from the saddlebag. Her fingers were numb with cold, blue at the tips. She struck one against the rock. The wind blew it out. She struck another. It flared and died. Cade started to rise to help her. "Let me do it," he croaked. "No," Isabel said. She did not look up. "Sit down. Cade, you walked 10 miles today. I can do this." She cupped her hands around the third match, shielding it with her body, feeding the tiny flame into a nest of dry grass. She blew on it gently, coaxing it to life. Smoke curled up, then a tongue of orange fire. She added larger sticks until the fire crackled. She turned to him, a smudge of soot on her cheek, and smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was full of victory. Cade looked at her with a pride that made his chest ache. She was learning. Later, he took the revolver from his belt. It was heavy, a Colt Navy that had seen the war. "You need to know how to use this," Cade said. Isabel took the gun. It was heavy in her hand. She looked at it with distaste, remembering the violence of the church, but she nodded. "Hold it with 2 hands, Cade instructed. Standing behind her, "Do not lock your elbows. Squeeze. Do not jerk." She fired at a dead stump 20 yards away. The kick of the weapon surprised her, throwing her aim high. "Again," Cade said gently. "Breathe out, then squeeze." She fired again. Bark flew from the stump. "Good," Cade said. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder for a moment. She leaned back into him, the gun lowered. "I never thought I would hold a gun," Isabel whispered. "I was taught to hold a teacup. I was taught to hold a needle." "You are not holding a teacup anymore," Cade said. "You are holding your life." The nights were the hardest. The temperature plunged well below freezing. They had only 2 blankets and the heat of their own bodies. They slept huddled together in whatever shelter they could find, a shallow cave, a grove of twisted juniper. In the dark, the fear would come. Isabel would wake up gasping, her heart hammering. dreaming of the heavy velvet drapes and the sound of the piano lid slamming down. Cade would be there instantly. He would pull her tight against his chest, his rough hands stroking her hair. "I am here," he would whisper. "I am here." He is not. One night, the wind died down, and a profound silence settled over the Badlands. Large, wet snowflakes began to drift down from a leaden sky. They hissed as they hit the small fire. Isabel sat close to Cade, wrapped in the blankets. She was staring into the flames. "I am not afraid of dying," she said suddenly. Her voice was clear in the quiet night. Cade looked at her. The snow was catching in her dark hair like stars. "I thought I would be," she continued. "I thought the idea of starving out here, or freezing, I thought it would terrify me. But it does not." "What are you afraid of?" Cade asked. Isabel turned to him. Her eyes were dark pools of pain. "I'm afraid of being erased," she said. "I'm afraid that they will drag me back, and he will tell everyone that I am crazy, that I imagined it all, that the bruises were my own clumsiness, that the baby I lost." She choked on the words. "I'm afraid that I will scream the truth, and no one will hear me. I'm afraid that I will live 50 years in that house, and when I die, the tombstone will say, 'Beloved wife,' and it will be the biggest lie of all." Cade reached out and took her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the line of her jaw. He looked at her with a ferocity that burned hotter than the fire. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was low and rough. "I will not let that happen." "How can you stop it?" Isabel asked. "He is the law." "I do not care if he is the Almighty himself," Cade swore. "I will not let him erase you. Your voice matters. Isabel, your pain matters. If I have to burn this whole territory down to make them hear you, I will do it. You are not a ghost. You are the most real thing I have ever known." Isabel looked at him, and she believed him. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was a desperate, grateful kiss. The desire that flared between them was not just physical. It was an affirmation of life in the face of the cold and the dark. They lay together as the snow fell, covering their tracks, covering the world. 2 warm heartbeats in a landscape of ice. 2 days later, reality caught up with them. They had reached a box canyon with high, sheer walls. There was no way out but the way they had come. They had eaten the last of the scavenged berries. The canteen was dry. Blue was limping badly, his left foreleg swollen. Cade stood looking at the horse, his hand resting on the animal's withers. He looked at the sky. It was gray and heavy. More snow was coming. A blizzard this time. If they stayed here, the storm would bury them. If they tried to push over the pass, the horse would die, and they would likely freeze on foot. And the posse was close. Cade had seen the smoke of their campfires that morning. Only 5 miles back, they were relentless. The judge was driving them hard. Cade turned to Isabel. She was sitting on a rock, trying to mend a tear in her skirt with a thorn. She looked up at him. She saw the look in his eyes, and she stopped. "We cannot go on, can we?" she asked quietly. Cade shook his head. "No, the horse is done. We are out of food. If the storm hits us out here—" He trailed off. Isabel stood up. She walked over to him and took his hand. Her grip was strong. "So we go back," she said. Cade looked at her, surprised by her steel. "If they catch us out here," Cade said, "they will shoot me and drag you back. The story will be whatever the judge wants it to be. You will be the confused victim, and I will be the dead villain. But if we go back—" Isabel started. "If we go back," Cade said, "we go back on our terms. We ride in while we can still sit in the saddle. We stand in front of the town. We make them look us in the eye. It is suicide," Isabel said. "Maybe," Cade answered. "But it is honest. We tell the truth. We show them everything. And if we die standing up. We die with our names." Isabel looked at the barren canyon walls. She looked at the gray sky. She thought of the tombstone that said, "Beloved wife." "Let us go back," she said. "I am done running." The return to Red Hollow was a grim mirror of Cade's first ride into town, the day he had seen the bruise on her wrist. But this time, the world was frozen. The cottonwoods were bare skeletons rattling in the wind. The puddles in the road were sheets of gray ice that cracked under the horses' hooves. They rode blue together, Isabel sitting in front of Cade now, his arms wrapped around her to hold the reins. She wore his coat, wrapped tight. He wore only his vest and shirt, shivering slightly, but his back was straight as a plumb line. It was noon when they entered the main street. The sun was a pale disk behind the clouds, casting a flat, shadowless light. The town seemed to hold its breath. A dog barked, then fell silent. People stepped out of the mercantile, the saloon, the boarding house. They watched in stunned silence. They had expected to see a body draped over a saddle, or a woman weeping in ropes. Instead, they saw a man and a woman riding with their heads high, exhausted, filthy, but unbroken. Cade rode straight to the courthouse. He pulled Blue to a halt. The horse lowered its head, trembling with fatigue. Cade dismounted, his boots hitting the frozen mud with a heavy thud. He reached up and helped Isabel down. She stood beside him, swaying slightly, but she found her footing. She looked at the crowd gathering on the boardwalks. She did not lower her eyes. The door of the courthouse banged open. Sheriff Brady stepped out, a shotgun in his hands. Behind him came 3 deputies, and then Judge Horace Bellamy. The judge stopped at the top of the stairs. He looked at the pair of them standing in the street. He looked at the defiance in Isabel's posture. His face twisted into a mask of incredulity and rage. "You have some nerve." "Walker," the sheriff said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I am not here to fight." "Jim," Cade said. His voice was raspy but loud. "We are done running. Take him," the judge screamed. "Arrest him, and get my wife away from that animal." 2 deputies started forward, but they stopped when Cade rested his hand on the butt of his pistol. He did not draw it. He just held his ground. "Wait," the sheriff said, holding up a hand. Isabel stepped forward. She moved away from Cade, standing alone in the center of the street. The wind whipped her hair across her face. "I am not a victim," she shouted. Her voice cracked, dry and brittle, but it carried, "I was not kidnapped." She said, "I ran away. I chose to leave." She looked up at the judge. "I chose to leave a man who beats me," she declared. A murmur ran through the crowd. "She is hysterical," the judge shouted, starting down the stairs. "She has been out in the cold for days. She does not know what she is saying." "I know exactly what I am saying," Isabel screamed back. She reached up and tore open the buttons of the heavy duster coat. She pulled it off, letting it fall to the frozen mud. She stood in her torn gray dress. She ripped the sleeve of her dress, the fabric giving way with a tearing sound. She exposed her arm, bare to the biting cold. The bruises were there, the old yellow ones, the green ones, and the dark, ugly marks where he had grabbed her in the church. They stood out like brands against her pale skin. "Look at them," she demanded, turning to face the townspeople. "Look at what your pillar of the community did." She pointed at the judge. "He threw me down the stairs," she cried. "He killed my baby. He told you I was barren, but he kicked the life out of me." The silence in the street was absolute. The wind whistled through the eaves, but no human spoke. The truth hung in the air, naked and undeniable. The baker's wife put a hand to her mouth. Silas, the rancher, took off his hat. They could not look away. The illusion of the judge's morality shattered like glass dropped on stone. Reverend Miller stepped out of the crowd. "Mrs. Bellamy," he stammered. "The vows of marriage, forgiveness." "My vows were broken by his fists," Isabel shouted at the preacher. "There is no God in his house, only fear." The judge looked around. He saw the faces of the townspeople changing. He saw the respect draining away. Replaced by horror and judgment, he saw his power evaporating like mist. He looked at Isabel. She was the source of it. She was the ruin of him. If he could not possess her, no one would. If he could not control the story, he would end it. "You lying witch," the judge whispered. His hand moved. It was a blur of motion. He reached into his coat and drew the derringer. He did not aim at Cade. He aimed straight at Isabel's chest. "No!" Cade screamed. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Cade saw the glint of nickel. He saw the madness in the judge's eyes. He saw Isabel standing there, defenseless, her truth spoken. Cade did not reach for his own gun. There was no time. He lunged. He threw himself across the space between them, his body colliding with Isabel's, shoving her backward just as the gun cracked. The sound was small, a popping noise, but the impact was heavy. Cade grunted, his body jerking as the bullet tore into his left shoulder. He hit the ground, rolling, dragging Isabel down with him. Chaos exploded. Women screamed, men shouted. Cade ignored the pain in his shoulder. It was a white-hot fire, but he pushed it down. He scrambled to his knees, his right hand flying to his holster. The judge was cocking the second barrel. He was stepping forward, eyes fixed on the pile of bodies in the street, intent on finishing it. Cade drew his Colt. He did not aim for the hand this time. He did not aim to disarm. He fired. The heavy roar of the Navy Colt drowned out every other sound. The bullet hit the judge in the center of his chest. It lifted him off his feet. He was thrown backward, his arms flailing. He landed hard on the wooden steps of the courthouse, the very steps he had ruled from for 20 years. The judge gasped. He tried to sit up, but his strength failed him. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his white shirt. He looked up at the sky, his eyes wide with shock and fury. He tried to speak, to curse them one last time, but only a gurgle of blood came out. His head fell back against the wood. His eyes stared fixedly at nothing. Judge Horace Bellamy was dead. Cade slumped forward, his hand pressing against his bleeding shoulder. "Cade!" Isabel screamed. She scrambled over to him, her hands frantic. She pressed them against his wound, the blood hot on her frozen fingers. "I am all right," Cade gasped, his face pale. "I am all right. It went through." The sheriff rushed forward. He kicked the derringer away from the judge's dead hand. He looked at the body, then at Cade and Isabel. "Hold your fire!" the sheriff shouted to his deputies. "It is over." He knelt beside Cade. He looked at the wound. "You are lucky." "Walker," the sheriff said grimly. An inch lower and it would have hit the heart. He looked at the judge's body. "He drew on an unarmed woman," the sheriff said loudly, addressing the crowd. "I saw it. We all saw it. I saw it," Silas shouted. "He tried to kill her. Cade saved her," another woman cried. The town, forced to confront the wreckage, chose their side at last. The man they had feared was dead. The man they had despised was bleeding in the dirt, having taken a bullet for a woman who was not his wife. The inquiry took 3 days. It was held in the saloon, as the courthouse felt too much like a tomb. Cade sat with his arm in a sling. Isabel sat beside him. The sheriff presided. Witness after witness stood up. They testified that the judge had fired first. They testified to the bruises they had seen on Isabel's arm in the street. The doctor, finally shamed into honesty, admitted that he had treated Isabel for falls multiple times in the past. The verdict was delivered at noon on the 3rd day. Justifiable homicide. Defense of another. Cade Walker was a free man. But freedom did not mean belonging. Red Hollow was a small town. It had a long memory. Too much blood had been spilled on the courthouse steps. Every time Cade walked down the street, people would see the ghost of the judge. Every time they looked at Isabel, they would remember their own complicity in her suffering. They could not stay. A week later, the wagon was loaded. It was a modest rig, pulled by 2 mules Cade had traded for. Blue was tied to the back, limping but healing. They had sold Cade's land to Silas for enough money to get a fresh start. They had sold the contents of the judge's house, Isabel's inheritance, and given half the money to the church. A final gesture of grace from a woman who had been shown none. They said their goodbyes at the edge of town. The sheriff shook Cade's hand. "Good luck, Walker," he said quietly. "Go far. Do not look back." "I won't," Cade said. Isabel sat on the wagon bench, wrapped in a heavy wool coat. She looked at the town one last time. She saw the leaning steeple, the warped sidewalks, the brick courthouse. It all looked small now. It looked like a stage set for a play she had finished acting in. Cade climbed up beside her. He took the reins in his good hand. "Ready?" he asked. Isabel looked at him. She saw the gray in his beard, the lines around his eyes, the sling on his arm. She saw the man who had ridden into hell for her. "Yes," she said. Cade clucked to the mules. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels creaking in the cold air. They rode up the ridge that overlooked the valley. At the top, Cade pulled the mules to a stop. They looked back. Red Hollow sat in the bottom of the bowl, smoke rising from its chimneys. It was just a place. It held no power over them anymore. They looked ahead. The land stretched out before them, vast and terrifying and beautiful. Distant river valleys, purple mountains, territories where their names meant nothing. Isabel reached out and took Cade's hand, her fingers interlaced with his. "Where do we go?" she asked. "West," Cade said. "Toward the river. Toward. We will find a spot with good water, maybe some trees. A quiet place," Isabel said. "A quiet place." Cade agreed. Isabel squeezed his hand. "I am not afraid," she said. Cade looked at her. He smiled, and it reached his eyes. "I know," he said. He snapped the reins. The wagon began to roll down the other side of the ridge, away from the past. The sun was dipping low, painting the wild land in shades of gold and fire. The wind was still harsh, and the world was still unforgiving. But between them burned a love that had been forged in darkness and tested by fire. It was strong enough to stand against any judgment. The future was uncertain, but as the wagon wheels turned, carrying them into the vast American West, they knew one thing for sure. It was theirs. Thank you for listening to this story. We have traveled a long, dusty road with Cade and Isabel, from the silent repression of Red Hollow to the wild freedom of the Badlands. I hope their journey has moved you as much as it moved me to write it. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are listening from. Are you in a busy city dreaming of the open range? Or are you somewhere quiet, listening to the wind? If you enjoyed this tale of love, survival, and justice, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West so you never miss a story. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. What did you think of Isabel's choice? Would you have done the same? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.